Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It was supposed to be a routine check. I'd done it 100 times before. Drive out to the old, disused campgrounds, make sure no kids were out there messing around, and be back by sundown. Easy. At least, that's what I kept telling myself until the sun dipped below the trees, and I was left standing in the middle of that desolate clearing with nothing but the sounds of the forest and something else. There was something unsettling about the place. It always had been. Ever since I first started working as a park ranger 5 years ago, Campground 14 hadn't been used in over a decade, and for good reason. People said it was haunted or cursed, but I always figured that was just local superstition. A way for the older rangers to scare the newbies, you know? I never bought into that stuff. The Park Service shut it down after a string of accidents, missing hikers, campers who never returned. It's all in the reports, but there were never any clear answers. Officially, it was deemed too remote, too hard to maintain, and frankly, too much of a liability. Unofficially, well, people talked. Rangers told stories around campfires about how the place was cursed, that something lived out there. Some even swore they'd seen things, but I'd chalked it up to late shifts and overactive imaginations. Still, every few months, I was sent out there to check on it. Even closed sites needed upkeep. The drive out was a long one, about an hour from the main station, and then another 30 minutes on foot to reach the actual campground. It wasn't marked anymore. The trails leading in were overgrown, barely recognizable except to those who'd worked here long enough to remember. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the dense forest as I parked my truck at the trailhead. The woods were quiet, too quiet, now that I think about it. Usually, you could hear birds, the rustle of leaves, maybe even a deer darting through the underbrush. But today, nothing. It felt like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I shrugged off the unease and grabbed my gear. A flashlight, a radio, and a map, even though I knew the place like the back of my hand. As I made my way down the path, the tall trees closed in around me, their branches twisting overhead like gnarled fingers. The sky above turned a deeper shade of orange as the sun sank lower. I needed to get in, take a look around, and get out before dark. The campground appeared ahead of me, as if the trees just decided to stop growing at the same spot. Empty fire pits, broken picnic tables, and what remained of the old latrine stood like forgotten relics of another time. No one had been here for years, at least not officially, but something was off. Things weren't quite as I remembered them. The first thing I noticed was the tents. There were 2 of them, half collapsed and weathered, but they definitely hadn't been there the last time I checked. They were covered in dirt, their fabric torn and shredded as though someone or something had tried to claw their way in. Scattered around were the remnants of a campsite, pots, a couple of bags, and clothes. All of it looked old, like it had been left to rot for years, but I knew that wasn't possible. I had checked this place only 6 months ago. I radioed back to the station. "This is Ranger Kyle. I'm out at Campground 14 and I've got some unusual activity. Looks like a campsite, but it's in bad shape. Anyone have a record of campers out here recently?" Static crackled back at me for a moment before a voice finally responded. "Negative, Kyle. That site's been closed for years. Nobody's been assigned to camp there." I frowned. "Yeah, that's what I thought. I'll take a closer look." There was no sign of the campers, no bodies, no blood, no tracks. Just the eerie quiet of the forest around me. It felt like the place was holding on to something, a memory. I pulled out my flashlight as the sun started to fade behind the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing. Then I noticed the footprints, huge, canine-like tracks, deep in the dirt, leading away from the tents and into the woods. My heart skipped a beat. No dog would make prints that big. It had to be a bear, I thought. But even then, the size was wrong. I knelt down to get a closer look, and that's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I stood up slowly, every hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My flashlight scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I wasn't alone out here. Okay, enough of this, I muttered to myself. I needed to get out. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the direction of the trees. My flashlight flicked toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, something huge, standing between the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. It moved silently, almost like a shadow, but then it stepped closer, and the beam of my flashlight caught its face. It looked like a dog. No, a wolf. But it was standing on two legs, towering over the brush, with long, powerful limbs and matted fur that seemed to blend into the darkness. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing a sickly yellow, and its mouth was pulled back in a snarl, revealing long, sharp teeth. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, and it was staring right at me. I froze, my mind racing. I'd heard stories about creatures in the woods, cryptids, people called them, but I'd never believed any of it. Not really. Not until now. The thing growled again, deeper this time, as if it was warning me. I took a slow step backward, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Predators chased things that ran. My hand reached for my radio again, but I knew there wasn't much it could do. Even if I called for backup, no one would make it out here in time. I was on my own. The creature stepped forward, and for the first time, I could see just how massive it was. Easily over 7 feet tall, its body rippled with muscle under its fur. Its legs bent like a wolf's, but its upper body, those arms, looked disturbingly human. Clawed hands hung at its sides, twitching, as if deciding whether or not to attack. I couldn't take it anymore. My body moved before my mind caught up, and I turned, sprinting back down the path toward my truck. The forest blurred around me, branches slapping at my face as I ran. I could hear it behind me, the pounding of its feet, faster than any animal should be able to move. Every second felt like an eternity, my breath ragged and my muscles screaming. The path seemed longer on the way back. My legs were shaking, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back, though I could feel it closing in. The growls grew louder, more savage, until they were right on top of me. I burst into the clearing where my truck was parked, fumbling for my keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip them. I slammed into the door, threw it open, and jumped inside just as something huge crashed through the brush behind me. I turned the ignition, and the engine roared to life. My headlights illuminated the road ahead. But just for a split second, they also lit up what stood behind me. The creature, Dogman, Wolfman, whatever it was, stood at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing in the beams of light. It was watching me, just watching, as if it had made its point. With trembling hands, I floored the gas pedal and sped out of there, gravel flying behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was back at the station, heart racing, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I reported what I saw. They wrote it down, but I could tell they didn't believe me. I didn't expect them to. Hell, I barely believed it myself. But the next time they send someone out to check on Campground 14, it won't be me. It won't ever be me again. Story 2. The howl that echoed through the forest that night wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It was primal, guttural, and sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. I've been a park ranger for over a decade, and I thought I knew every sound these woods could make. I was wrong. My name's Sarah, and I've called Blackwood National Forest my home and workplace for the past 12 years. I've seen my fair share of strange things out here. Lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, even the occasional illegal hunting operation. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that moonless October night. It started with a series of reports from campers about unusual noises after dark. Most dismissed it as coyotes or maybe a mountain lion, but something about the descriptions nagged at me. The campers spoke of howls that seemed to come from something much larger, something that made the earth tremble beneath their feet. I decided to investigate myself. Armed with my standard gear, flashlight, radio, sidearm, I set out just as the sun was dipping below the tree line. The forest took on that special kind of quiet that comes with twilight, the daytime creatures bedding down while the nocturnal ones hadn't yet stirred. As I made my way deeper into the woods, following one of the lesser-used trails, I kept my senses on high alert. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves drew my attention. But for the first hour or so, all I encountered were the usual forest denizens, a few startled deer, an owl taking flight from a nearby branch. It wasn't until full dark had settled that I heard it. A long, mournful howl that started low and rose to a pitch that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was close, much closer than I'd expected, and it was loud, reverberating through the trees and seeming to come from everywhere at once. I froze in place, my hand instinctively going to the holster at my hip. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I played my flashlight beam across the surrounding forest, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Cooper. I've got audible contact with something out here. Location is approximately 2 miles northeast of Campground B. Going to investigate further." The response came back, crackling with static. "Copy that, Ranger Cooper. Be careful out there. Check in every 15 minutes. I acknowledged and clipped the radio back to my belt. Part of me wanted to turn back, to wait until daylight and bring a team, but I knew that whatever had made that sound might be long gone by morning. If I was going to find answers, it had to be now. I moved forward cautiously, sweeping my flashlight back and forth across the trail and into the surrounding undergrowth. The forest seemed different now, almost alien. Shadows danced at the edge of my light, and more than once I thought I saw something large moving just beyond the beam's reach. After about 10 minutes of slow progress, I came across the first sign that this was more than just an oddly vocal coyote. There, pressed into a patch of soft earth beside the trail, was a footprint unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, and distinctly canine in shape. But the impression was deep, suggesting whatever left it was incredibly heavy. I crouched down to examine it more closely, my mind racing. No known animal in these parts could have left a print like this. A wolf, far too big. A bear, wrong shape entirely. As I studied the impression, I became aware of a faint, musty odor in the air, like wet dog mixed with something earthier, almost rotting. The sound of a branch snapping nearby made me jerk upright, my flashlight beam darting toward the noise. For a split second, I thought I saw a flash of movement, something large ducking behind a thick oak tree. But when I approached, there was nothing there. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Ranger Cooper, this is Base. Status check." I took a shaky breath before responding. "Base, Cooper here. I found some unusual tracks, large, canine-like, continuing to investigate." There was a pause before the reply came. "Do you need backup, Cooper?" I hesitated. Part of me screamed, "Yes, get out of here, bring an entire team." But another part, the part that had drawn me to this job in the first place, urged me to press on. "Negative, Base. I'll check in again in 15. Cooper out." I continued down the trail, finding more of the massive prints. They were fresh, the edges still sharp in the soft forest loam. Whatever had left them was close, and it was big. The trees began to thin out, and I realized I was approaching a small clearing. As I neared the edge of the open space, that musty odor grew stronger, almost overpowering. I played my flashlight across the clearing and felt my blood run cold. In the center of the open space lay the carcasses of several deer, but this wasn't the work of normal predators. The bodies were torn apart, limbs scattered across the forest floor. Some looked partially eaten. The grass was slick with blood, gleaming wetly in my flashlight beam. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never encountered anything like this. Whatever had done this was powerful, vicious, and definitely not a natural part of this ecosystem. As I swept my light across the grisly scene, something caught my eye. There, at the far edge of the clearing, was a tuft of fur caught on a low-hanging branch. I approached cautiously, my boots squelching in the blood-soaked earth. The fur was coarse and dark, unlike anything I'd seen on the local wildlife, and there was so much of it. The tuft was the size of my fist. I was so focused on the fur that I almost missed the sound. A low, rumbling growl, so deep I felt it in my chest before I heard it with my ears. It came from behind me, from the direction I'd entered the clearing. Slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else, I turned around. My flashlight beam fell on a pair of eyes reflecting the light, glowing an eerie yellowish green. They were at least 7 feet off the ground. The creature stepped forward into the edge of my light's reach, and I felt the air leave my lungs. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, shaggy fur. Its body was a nightmarish blend of human and wolf, powerfully muscled limbs ending in massive, clawed hands, a broad chest tapering to a narrow waist, but its head, God, its head was pure predator. A long, canine muzzle filled with gleaming teeth, pointed ears laid flat against its skull, those terrifying eyes fixed directly on me. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a tableau of predator and prey. My hand inched towards my sidearm, though I knew it would be useless against something this size. The creature's nostrils flared, scenting the air, and I realized with horrifying certainty that it could smell my fear. Its muscles bunched, preparing to lunge, and I knew I had only seconds to act. I fumbled for the flare gun in my pack, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy with terror. Just as the creature began to move, I raised the flare gun and fired. The sudden burst of bright red light and the accompanying bang seemed to startle the beast. It reared back, letting out a hair-raising howl of anger and pain. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the trail or direction. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that thing. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest around me was dark and unfamiliar. With shaking hands, I pulled out my radio. "Base," I panted. "This is Cooper. I need immediate extraction. I've encountered something big, dangerous. I don't know my exact location." The response was immediate. "Copy that, Cooper. We're triangulating your position now. Stay where you are. Help is on the way." I sagged against a tree, relief washing over me. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. From somewhere in the darkness came the sound of branches cracking under heavy footsteps. Whatever I had encountered in that clearing, I knew 2 things for certain. It wasn't a natural animal, and it wasn't finished with me. As I huddled there in the dark, waiting for rescue, one thought kept running through my mind. The forests I thought I knew so well held secrets far darker and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The long night ahead promised to be the longest of my life, and I wasn't sure if I'd make it to see the dawn. But one thing was clear. If I survived this, the forests of Blackwood would never be the same for me again. Story 3. They say the fog in the mountains can do strange things to your mind, make you see shadows that aren't there, hear footsteps in the silence, but out there, lost in the middle of that thick, suffocating mist. I wasn't imagining anything. Something was out there with us, and it wasn't human. We hadn't planned to hike so late. The trail wasn't difficult, but Ben wanted to make it to the ridge before sunset, insisting the view would be worth it. I should have argued more, should have said something when the fog started rolling in earlier than usual, but Ben was stubborn. He always had been. By the time we reached the ridge, the valley below was swallowed in a thick blanket of fog, the kind that clings to your skin and muffles all sound. The sun, which had been our only source of warmth, dipped below the horizon without much fanfare, leaving the world around us cold and grey. "I told you it would be beautiful," Ben said, grinning as he set his pack down. He acted like everything was fine, like the growing sense of unease creeping up my spine was just my imagination. I nodded, but my gut told me otherwise. The view was supposed to be stunning, vast stretches of untouched forest and jagged mountain peaks, but the fog was too thick to see anything. It wasn't natural. The way it rolled up the mountainside like a living thing, swallowing everything in its path, gave me the distinct feeling we were being smothered, trapped. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, my voice sounding too small in the heavy silence. Ben scoffed, shaking his head. "It'll clear up soon. Let's just enjoy the peace for a bit." But it didn't clear. It only thickened, closing in around us until we couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The trees, once solid and familiar, became dark shapes in the mist, twisted and distorted. Even the air felt wrong, too still, too quiet, like the world itself had gone to sleep, and we were the only ones left awake. I should have insisted we leave then, but something about Ben's calm demeanor made me second-guess myself. He wasn't worried, so why should I be? We were just two hikers on a trail, miles away from any real danger, or so I thought. After what felt like an eternity, Ben stood up, brushing off his pants. "All right, let's head back. The trail's not gonna walk itself." He smiled, but I noticed how he glanced uneasily at the fog, his confidence wavering for the first time. We started down the trail, but it was like walking through a dream. Every step felt slow, and the fog seemed to shift, swirling around us as if it had a mind of its own. I kept close to Ben, but even he was just a faint outline in the mist, barely visible in the dim light of his headlamp. The silence pressed in on us, so thick it felt like I could choke on it, and then the footsteps started. At first, I thought it was just our own, the crunch of boots on gravel and dirt. But no, it was something else, something heavier, slower, trailing just out of sight in the fog. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Ben, do you hear that?" He stopped too, turning to face me, his expression tense. "Hear what?" I strained to listen, but the footsteps had stopped. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "Never mind. I thought I heard something." We continued, but the moment we started walking again, the footsteps returned. Closer this time, deliberate, matching our pace as we moved down the trail. This time, Ben heard it too. He froze, spinning around with his flashlight pointed into the fog behind us. "Who's there?" There was no response, just the oppressive silence. "We should keep moving," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's probably an animal." But we both knew better. No animal walks on two legs. No animal tracks humans like that, staying just out of reach, hidden in the mist. We quickened our pace, almost jogging now, but the thing, whatever it was, kept up with us, its footsteps growing louder, more insistent. Every few seconds, we'd stop and whip around, flashlights scanning the thick fog, but there was never anything there. Just trees and mist. Nothing that could explain the heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing through the forest. "Maybe it's another hiker," Ben muttered, his voice strained. "Someone lost in the fog like us." I didn't say anything. We both knew that wasn't the case. No hiker would follow us this way, creeping just out of sight without saying a word. I could feel it in my bones. Something was wrong, very wrong. After what felt like hours, we reached a fork in the trail. I didn't even remember it being there on the way up, but the fog had thrown off my sense of direction. The signpost was worn and weathered, barely legible in the dim light of our headlamps. Ben squinted at it, his flashlight flickering in the fog. "Which way do you think?" "I don't know," I replied, panic starting to settle in. This wasn't here before. We didn't take this path. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was even worse. It hung in the air like a threat, heavy and oppressive. I could feel eyes on us, watching, waiting. "We have to keep moving," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by something I hadn't seen in him before: fear. We took the path to the right, hoping it would lead us back to the main trail. But the fog didn't let up. It only seemed to get thicker, denser, the trees closing in around us like prison bars. The footsteps returned, this time closer than ever, too close. "Ben!" I grabbed his arm, pulling him to a stop. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps now, fear clawing at my throat. "There's something out there." Before he could respond, we heard it, a deep, guttural sound that sent a chill straight down my spine. It wasn't a growl exactly, more like a low rumble, something massive shifting its weight in the fog just beyond our vision. We stood frozen, too terrified to move, too terrified to run, and then, from the mist, it emerged. At first it was just a shadow, a hulking silhouette that towered over the trees, but as it moved closer, its form became clearer, a massive, humanoid figure covered in thick, dark hair, its arms long and muscular, its body hunched as it moved through the fog with terrifying ease. I couldn't breathe, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was too big, too unnatural to be real. Sasquatch. The word floated through my mind like a distant echo, but I couldn't believe it, couldn't accept that something like this existed. Not here, not now. The creature stopped a few feet away from us, its eyes glowing faintly in the mist. It didn't move, didn't growl or attack. It just stood there, watching us with an unsettling intelligence in its gaze. Ben, to his credit, didn't scream. He didn't move either, though his entire body was trembling. What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone dry, my legs shaking uncontrollably. Every instinct told me to run, but I knew I wouldn't make it far. This thing, whatever it was, could tear us apart in seconds if it wanted to. For what felt like hours, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff with the creature. It tilted its head slightly, almost as if studying us, deciding whether or not we were worth its time. And then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the fog, its massive form swallowed by the mist in seconds. The footsteps faded, and we were left standing in the thick, oppressive silence once again. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We just stood there, trying to process what had just happened, trying to convince ourselves that we hadn't just come face to face with something out of a nightmare. Finally, Ben broke the silence. "Let's get the hell out of here." I nodded, too shaken to speak. We moved quickly, not bothering to check if the creature was still following us. We didn't care. We just needed to get back. Back to the truck, back to safety, back to something that made sense. The fog followed us all the way down the trail, clinging to us like a shadow, and though the footsteps had stopped, the feeling of being watched never went away. When we finally reached the parking lot, I almost collapsed with relief. The headlights of the truck cut through the fog like a lifeline, guiding us back to reality. We didn't talk about it on the drive home. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something terrifying. And I knew one thing for sure: I would never hike that trail again, not with the fog rolling in, not ever. Story 4. The cave seemed like salvation at first. We didn't realize we were walking into a nightmare. My name's Mike, and I've been an avid hiker for most of my adult life. I thought I'd seen it all on the trails, wildlife encounters, treacherous weather, you name it. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that fateful trip to the Cascade Mountains with my buddy, Dave. It was supposed to be a routine 3-day hike. We'd done similar trips dozens of times before. The weather forecast looked perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures. We packed light, confident in our skills and experience. Looking back, that confidence was our first mistake. The trouble started on the second day. We'd planned to reach the summit of Mount Hollow by mid-afternoon, but a series of small setbacks, a twisted ankle, a misread map, put us behind schedule. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, we realized we weren't going to make our intended campsite before dark. "We should find a spot to hunker down for the night," Dave suggested, eyeing the darkening sky warily. I nodded, trying to ignore the gnawing worry in my gut. We were in a section of the mountain I wasn't familiar with, and the terrain was rougher than I'd expected. Steep cliffs and dense forest surrounded us, with no obvious flat areas for camping. As twilight deepened into true darkness, a chill wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of rain. We pushed on, using our headlamps to illuminate the increasingly treacherous path. That's when Dave spotted it, a dark opening in the rock face to our right. "And hey, Mike, I think there's a cave over there," he called out, already moving toward it. I followed, relief washing over me at the prospect of shelter. As we approached, I played my light over the entrance. It was larger than I'd first thought, easily big enough for us to stand upright inside. "Looks perfect," Dave said, grinning. "And we can wait out the night here and get back on track in the morning." I nodded, but something made me hesitate at the entrance. There was a smell coming from the cave, musty and wild, like wet fur and decay. But with the wind picking up and the first drops of rain beginning to fall, we didn't have much choice. We entered cautiously, our headlamp beams cutting through the darkness. The cave was deeper than it had appeared from outside, stretching back into the mountain. As we moved further in, seeking a dry spot to set up camp, something caught my eye. "Dave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "look at this." There, in the soft earth of the cave floor, was a footprint, but not just any footprint. This was enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot, and its shape. It was vaguely human-like, but with clear claw marks at the end of each toe. Dave crouched down to examine it, his face pale in the harsh light of our lamps. "What the hell made that?" he muttered. Before I could answer, a low rumble of thunder echoed from outside, making us both jump. The rain was coming down in earnest now, drumming against the rocks at the cave entrance. Let's just set up camp," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever made that print is probably long gone." We moved deeper into the cave, finding a relatively flat area about 50 feet from the entrance. As we unpacked our sleeping bags and a small camp stove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every random noise making my heart race. We ate a quick meal of dehydrated stew, neither of us talking much. The storm outside grew more intense, lightning occasionally illuminating the cave entrance in stark, blue-white flashes. As we prepared to turn in for the night, Dave suddenly froze, his head cocked to one side. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I listened intently, but all I could hear was the pounding of the rain and the rumble of distant thunder. Then, in a lull between thunderclaps, I heard it too, a sound like heavy breathing coming from deeper in the cave. We exchanged a look of pure terror. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, we turned our headlamps toward the back of the cave. The beams of light revealed a tunnel leading further into the mountain, disappearing into darkness beyond their reach. And there, just at the edge of the light, was movement. Something massive shifted in the shadows, accompanied by the scrape of claws on stone. "Oh, God," Dave breathed. "We need to get out of here, now." But as we turned toward the cave entrance, a deafening roar echoed through the cavern, shaking loose small stones from the ceiling. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, part bear, part wolf, but with an almost human quality that made it all the more terrifying. We ran, grabbing what we could of our gear. We bolted for the entrance. But the rain had turned the ground outside into a slick mess of mud. Dave made it out first, his feet slipping on the wet stones. I was right behind him when I heard another roar, much closer this time. I chanced to look back and immediately wished I hadn't. Emerging from the shadows was a creature out of a nightmare. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy, dark fur. Its body was powerfully built, a terrifying blend of human and animal, but its face, God, Its face was like a wolf's, but twisted into an almost human expression of hunger and rage. I scrambled out of the cave, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Dave was a few yards ahead, struggling to find purchase on the muddy slope. "Run!" I screamed, my voice nearly lost in a crash of thunder. "Don't look back! Just run!" We plunged into the forest, heedless of the branches whipping at our faces and the treacherous ground beneath our feet. I could hear the creature behind us, its heavy footfalls and snarling breath far too close for comfort. We ran blindly through the night, the rain and darkness making it impossible to know where we were going. All that mattered was putting distance between us and that thing. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we burst into a small clearing. In the center stood an old fire tower, its metal frame silhouetted against the stormy sky. "There!" Dave gasped, pointing at the tower. "We can climb up!" It was our only chance. We sprinted across the clearing, the sound of pursuit growing ever closer. Dave reached the tower first, practically throwing himself onto the metal ladder. I was only steps behind, but those steps nearly cost me everything. As I grabbed the first rung of the ladder, I felt something slash across my back. White-hot pain bloomed between my shoulder blades, and I let out a scream of agony and terror. Somehow, I managed to hold on, pulling myself up the ladder with strength born of pure desperation. Dave reached down, grabbing my arm and hauling me up onto the first platform. We didn't stop there, continuing to climb until we reached the top of the tower, some 40 feet off the ground. Only then did we dare to look down. There, circling the base of the tower, was the creature. In the occasional flashes of lightning, we could see it clearly now. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, a monstrous hybrid of man and wolf, its yellow eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence as it glared up at us. For hours, we huddled in that tower, listening to the creature's frustrated howls and the crash of thunder. Neither of us spoke. We were too terrified to do anything but wait and pray for dawn. As the first light of day began to break through the clouds, we looked down to find the clearing empty. The creature, whatever it was, had vanished back into the forest. We waited another hour before daring to climb down, our bodies stiff and sore from the night's ordeal. The slash on my back was painful but shallow. I'd been lucky. It took us most of the day to find our way back to civilization, each snapping twig or rustling bush making us jump. When we finally reached the ranger station, we told them we'd gotten lost in the storm. How could we explain what we'd really seen? Who would believe us? That was 3 years ago. Dave and I don't talk much anymore. I think we both want to forget that night. But I know neither of us will ever truly be able to shake the memory of what we encountered in those mountains. I still hike, still love the outdoors, but I never stay out after dark anymore. And if I'm deep in the wilderness and hear a sound I can't immediately identify, I don't stop to investigate. I run. Because now I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our so-called civilized world. And sometimes, on nights when the wind howls outside my window, I lie awake and wonder, what if it followed us home? Story 5. The cold had a way of seeping into your bones out there, in the wilderness, where the trees stood like silent sentinels, and the snow swallowed all sound. It was supposed to be a quick weekend camping trip with friends, just as the fire and the winter woods. But when the blizzard came, and that howl echoed through the forest, we knew something was out there with us. Something far worse than the freezing cold. We shouldn't have stayed out that long. I knew it, Emily knew it, even Jake knew it, but he wouldn't admit it. Typical Jake. He was the one who suggested we head deeper into the woods for a real wilderness experience. Winter camping in the backcountry, he'd said, like it was the most exciting thing in the world. And I'll admit, at first, I was on board. Who wouldn't want to escape for a weekend, surrounded by nothing but snow-covered trees and silence? It was supposed to be peaceful, but no one expected the storm. The weather reports had mentioned light snow, nothing serious. just the kind of gentle flurries that dust the ground and make everything look like a postcard. What we got instead was a full-on blizzard, whiteout conditions, winds that howled through the trees like something alive, something angry. By the time we realized how bad it was too late to turn back. We huddled around the fire, trying to make the best of it. Jake was poking at the flames, still acting like everything was fine. "It'll blow over by morning," he said, his breath clouding in the freezing air. "We've got enough wood to last the night, and plenty of food, nothing to worry about." But I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. He didn't like admitting when he was wrong, but even he couldn't ignore the storm raging around us. The wind was relentless, and the snow kept piling up higher and higher around the tents. Emily sat across from me, bundled in her sleeping bag, eyes flicking nervously to the dark trees beyond the firelight. "We should have gone back," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind. "We should have left hours ago." I didn't disagree, but I didn't say anything. The last thing we needed was to panic. Jake would figure something out. He always did. That's when we heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on my ears, a high-pitched whistle cutting through the howling gusts. But then it came again, a long, wailing cry, almost like an animal, but not quite. Too sharp, too deliberate. It echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Jake froze, his hand halfway to the pile of firewood. "Ah, did you guys hear that?" Emily nodded slowly, her face pale in the flickering firelight. "What was that?" I listened, straining to hear over the roaring wind. The howl came again, louder this time, closer. It sounded like it was moving through the trees, circling us. "Probably just a coyote," Jake said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Coyotes don't sound like that," Emily whispered, hugging her knees to her chest. "But that didn't sound like an animal at all." I stood up, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The trees were tall, their branches heavy with snow, but I could barely make out their shapes through the swirling blizzard. Everything was a blur of white and black, and that sound, it wasn't just an animal's howl. It was more like something imitating one, something hungry. "We need to get inside the tents," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Get out of the wind and stay warm." Jake nodded, though I could tell he didn't like the idea of leaving the fire. None of us did. The fire was the only thing that felt safe. But the storm was getting worse, and our gear was set up a few yards away, tucked between the trees for some shelter. We hurried, grabbing our packs and stumbling through the snow. The wind cut through my jacket, biting into my skin. By the time I zipped myself into the tent, my fingers were numb and my face stung from the cold. The three of us huddled together in silence, listening to the wind batter the fabric of the tent. Every now and then, that strange howl would rise again, cutting through the storm like a knife. Each time, it was closer. It wasn't my imagination. Whatever it was circling us, getting bolder. Jake's face was grim in the dim light of his headlamp. He was no longer pretending everything was okay. "We'll wait until morning," he said quietly, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Once the sun comes up, we'll pack up and get out of here." Emily didn't say anything. She just stared at the tent walls, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't say it out loud, Paddu, but I wasn't sure we'd make it to morning. The hours dragged on. The wind howled, the snow piled higher, and that terrible wail kept coming, louder, closer. Sometimes it seemed to echo from every direction at once, bouncing off the trees like it was surrounding us. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke with a start to the sound of Emily screaming. "Something's out there!" she shrieked, scrambling to the far side of the tent. "I saw it! I saw it!" I fumbled for my headlamp, my heart racing as I turned it on. The dim light cut through the darkness of the tent, illuminating Emily's terrified face. Jake was already up, clutching his hunting knife like it would do any good against whatever was outside. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice shaking. Emily was sobbing now, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. "It was outside the tent. Just standing there watching us." The wind howled again, and with it came that same eerie, high-pitched wail, closer than ever. Jake unzipped the tent, shining his light out into the blizzard. I could barely make out the shapes of the trees through the swirling snow, but something was moving out there. A dark shape, taller than any man, looming just at the edge of the clearing. "Now close the tent," I hissed, pulling Emily back as she cowered in the corner. "Don't let it see us." But Jake wasn't listening. He stood frozen, staring out into the storm, his flashlight fixed on the shape. It moved slowly, almost lazily, like it had all the time in the world. I caught a glimpse of something pale, too pale, almost white against the snow, and then the shape was gone, disappearing into the darkness. What the hell was that?" Jake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for sure. That wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a bear either. It wasn't anything that belonged out here. We zipped the tent shut again and sat in silence, too scared to move, too scared to sleep. The wind roared outside, and every now and then I swore I could hear footsteps crunching through the snow. Slow, deliberate. Hours passed, though it felt like days. My body was stiff from the cold, my muscles aching from tension, and yet, somehow, exhaustion started to creep in. I couldn't fight it anymore. The adrenaline was wearing off. I closed my eyes, just for a moment. When I woke up, the tent was eerily silent. The storm had stopped. The wind was gone, and all I could hear was the soft patter of snow falling from the branches above. For a brief, glorious moment, I thought maybe it had all been a bad dream. Maybe we were fine. Maybe the sun was rising and we could pack up and go home. But when I unzipped the tent, what I saw made my heart stop. The campsite was a mess. Our gear was scattered, tents shredded like paper, but that wasn't the worst part. There, in the snow, were massive tracks, bigger than any human footprint, bigger than any animal. Long, clawed toes pressed deep into the snow, leading away from the camp and disappearing into the forest. Jake stood beside me, his face pale. "It came right up to the tent." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. We didn't waste any time packing up. We barely spoke, moving in silence as we gathered what little was left of our gear. Every few minutes, I'd glance back toward the trees, half expecting to see that pale shape watching us again. But we didn't see it, not again. As we hiked back down the mountain, I kept hearing that howl in my mind, that high-pitched wail that had circled us all night. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't human, and whatever it was, it had let us go. This time. Story 6. I never should have set up that camera. Some things are better left unseen. Mysteries of the forest that should remain just that. Mysteries. But my curiosity got the better of me, and now I can't unsee what I captured on film that night. My name is Alex, and I've been a wildlife photographer for the better part of 2 decades. I've trekked through jungles, across tundras, and into some of the most remote places on Earth to capture images of animals in their natural habitats. But it was in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, practically in my own backyard, where I encountered something that defied explanation and shook my understanding of the natural world to its core. It all started with the rumors, whispers among the locals about strange sightings in the deep woods, of something large moving through the trees at night. Most dismissed it as bear activity or overactive imaginations, but there was a persistence to these stories that piqued my professional interest. As a photographer who specialized in capturing elusive wildlife, the challenge was irresistible. I decided to set up a camera trap in a particularly remote area of the forest, about a day's hike from the nearest road. It was the kind of place where you could go for weeks without seeing another human being, perfect for undisturbed wildlife, or for something that didn't want to be seen. The hike-in was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I made my way through the ancient trees. The forest here was old, the kind of old that makes you feel small and insignificant. Massive cedars and Douglas firs towered overhead, their branches blocking out much of the sky. The forest floor was a thick carpet of moss and ferns, muffling my footsteps. I found what I thought was the perfect spot for my camera, a small clearing near a game trail, with clear signs of recent animal activity. As I set up the equipment, I noticed how quiet it was. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The camera was state-of-the-art, designed to capture high-quality images in low-light conditions. It was motion-activated and could take rapid-fire shots, perfect for catching fast-moving animals. I carefully camouflaged it, making sure it was secure and well hidden. As a final touch, I set up a small infrared floodlight nearby. It would be invisible to most animals, but would illuminate the area for the camera when triggered. With everything in place, I started the long hike back to civilization. I planned to return in a week to collect the memory card and see what, if anything, the camera had captured. That week dragged by, my anticipation growing with each passing day. When the time finally came to retrieve the camera, I set out at first light, eager to get there and back before nightfall. The feeling of being watched was stronger this time, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. I tried to convince myself it was just nerves, excitement about what I might have captured. I reached the clearing in the early afternoon. At first glance, everything seemed as I had left it, but as I approached the tree where I'd mounted the camera, my heart sank. The device was hanging at an odd angle, the sturdy metal casing dented and scratched. With trembling hands, I detached the camera from its mount. The damage was even worse up close. Deep gouges marred the metal, and the lens was cracked. Whatever had done this was powerful, and apparently not too happy about being photographed. I extracted the memory card, relieved to find it intact. Part of me wanted to view the images right there, but a growing sense of unease urged me to get back to the safety of civilization first. I packed up quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder as I hurried back down the trail. It wasn't until I was back in my studio, doors locked and curtains drawn, that I finally allowed myself to examine the contents of the memory card. The first few dozen images were what I expected: deer, elk, the occasional black bear, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I came to the images from the third night. The timestamp showed it was just after midnight when the camera first triggered. The initial shot showed nothing unusual, just the empty clearing illuminated by the infrared light. But in the next frame, taken just seconds later, there was something. At the edge of the frame, barely visible, were two glowing eyes reflecting the infrared light. They were set too high off the ground to be a bear or any other known animal in these woods. My breath caught in my throat as I clicked to the next image. The eyes were closer now, and I could make out a vague shape behind them. It was large, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in what looked like thick fur. But the proportions were all wrong for a bear. It stood upright, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. My hands were shaking as I moved to the next image. The creature was fully in frame now, and I felt my blood run cold. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The body was powerfully built, a bizarre mix of human and ape-like features. But the face, God, the face was nightmare fuel. Somewhere between human and animal, with a protruding snout filled with sharp teeth and eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural intelligence. The final image is the one that still haunts my dreams. The creature was lunging at the camera, massive hands with inch-long claws outstretched. Its mouth was open in what I imagined was a roar, revealing rows of gleaming teeth. The detail was incredible. I could see every strand of fur, every line in its inhuman face. And those eyes, they weren't just reflecting the infrared light. They were looking directly into the lens with an expression of rage and recognition. I sat there for hours, staring at those images, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hoax, a man in a costume perhaps, but deep down I knew the truth. The power needed to damage the camera like that. The sheer size and presence of the creature, this was no hoax. For days, I debated what to do with the images. Part of me wanted to share them with the world, to prove that there were still mysteries out there, things science couldn't explain, but another part, a more primal part, warned me of the dangers. If this creature was real, if it was out there in those woods, did I really want to draw attention to it, to potentially put others in harm's way? In the end, I decided to keep the images to myself. I locked the memory card away in a safe, telling myself I'd decide what to do with it later, but I knew I'd never share those photos. Some truths are too dangerous, too world-shattering to be known. I haven't been back to those woods since that day. My camera traps remain packed away, gathering dust in my garage. I still take photos, still love wildlife, but now I stick to the safe, the known, the explainable. But on dark nights, when the wind howls through the trees outside my window, I find myself thinking about what's out there in the deep woods. I remember those glowing eyes, that powerful form, the intelligence and rage in its expression. And I wonder, did I just happen to capture an image of it? Or did it allow itself to be seen? Sometimes, I swear I can hear something moving outside, something large. And in those moments, I'm gripped by a terrifying certainty. It followed me home. It's out there, watching, waiting, and one day it might decide to do more than just watch. So I keep the curtains drawn, the doors locked. I tell myself it's just my imagination, that there's nothing out there in the darkness, but deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of civilized life, and sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. But trust me when I say this, some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some creatures are better left unphotographed, because once you've seen them, truly seen them, you can never go back to the comfortable ignorance of before. You'll always know what's out there in the shadows, watching and waiting, and that knowledge, it'll haunt you for the rest of your days. Story 7. It was the kind of night where the moon hung so big and bright in the sky, you felt like it was watching you, staring down through the trees, casting long shadows that twisted and danced in the corners of your vision. I wasn't the type to believe in superstition, and I sure as hell didn't believe the stories about things that walked the woods on nights like this. But that night, when I found myself alone on the trail, those stories didn't feel so impossible anymore. I'd planned the night hike to clear my head. The past few weeks had been brutal at work, and I was desperate for some fresh air, some time alone. The forest had always been my place of escape, a place where the world felt quiet and predictable. I didn't want to wait for the weekend, and besides, what was the harm in a solo night hike under the full moon? The first few miles were peaceful enough. The trail wound through the dense forest, and the light from my headlamp was barely needed, thanks to the moon's glow. The trees stretched high above me, their branches whispering in the gentle breeze. I'd done this hike a dozen times before, but something about tonight felt different. There was an edge to the air, something tense that I couldn't quite shake. Still, I kept walking, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably the lack of sleep or the stress from work getting to me. People get jittery when they're tired, and I hadn't had a decent night's rest in days. After another mile or so, I reached the crest of the hill, where the trees thinned out and the trail opened up to a small clearing. I stopped to take a breath, looking out at the valley below, bathed in silver light. It should have been beautiful, peaceful even. But instead, it felt like the world was holding its breath. That's when I heard it. A snap, just a little way off the trail, behind me, like a branch breaking underfoot. I froze, my heart immediately kicking into high gear. I turned slowly, scanning the trees with my headlamp, but there was nothing, just shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. A deer, I told myself, maybe a raccoon. Something small, nothing to worry about. But the unease that had been nagging at me all night flared up again, stronger this time. I listened, standing still as a statue, but the forest had gone silent. The usual background hum of crickets and distant owl calls had vanished, replaced by a heavy, oppressive quiet. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the growing tension. I wasn't some rookie hiker. I knew the woods could play tricks on you at night. The quiet, that was normal. Sometimes animals went quiet when a predator was nearby. Maybe a bear was moving through the area. That's all it was, I told myself. No big deal. But my pulse wouldn't slow, and my instincts were screaming at me that something wasn't right. I forced myself to keep walking, though now my pace was faster. I wanted to make it to the lookout point and then head back. The moon lit up the trail ahead, but I kept my headlamp on, swinging it around every now and then, just to reassure myself there was nothing lurking in the trees. Then I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer, a rhythmic thud like footsteps. Not fast, not rushed, but deliberate, heavy. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart hammering in my chest, and swung my headlamp toward the sound. The beam cut through the trees, slicing through the shadows, but there was nothing. The forest was empty, as far as I could see, but I knew what I'd heard. Someone, or something, was out there. I called out, my voice more unsteady than I wanted it to be. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The silence pressed in again, thicker than before. My grip tightened on the strap of my backpack, and I took a step back, suddenly very aware of how alone I was out here. Alone, except for whatever was watching me from the trees. I decided to keep moving, quicker now. My mind raced with explanations, none of them good. Maybe it was a hiker, someone lost. But who goes hiking in the middle of the night, alone, without a light? Then I caught a glimpse of something, just out of the corner of my eye, past the reach of my headlamp. A shape, moving through the trees, tall and dark. The shadows shifted, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something, standing upright, like a person. But no, it couldn't have been. The figure was too tall, too broad, moving with an unnatural fluid grace that no human could manage. I stopped again, my breath catching in my throat, and that's when the howling started. It cut through the night, sharp and guttural, echoing off the trees. Not a wolf, not a coyote. This was something else entirely. It was deeper, more primal, filled with a rage that made my blood run cold. I turned, my legs moving before my brain could catch up, and I started running. The trail was familiar, but in my panic, every twist and turn felt foreign. The trees closed in around me, branches grabbing at my clothes like claws. The howling came again, closer this time, and then I heard it, those footsteps, faster now, heavy, crashing through the underbrush. It was following me. I sprinted as fast as I could, heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail seemed to stretch out endlessly in front of me, and no matter how fast I ran, the thing was getting closer. I could hear it, crashing through the woods just off to my right, moving parallel to the trail, tracking me. Then, in the flicker of my headlamp, I saw it. It stepped out from the trees, just for a moment, and I swear to God, it wasn't human. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, covered in dark, matted fur that clung to its massive frame. Its face, though, that's what froze me in my tracks. It looked like a wolf, but twisted, distorted, with glowing yellow eyes and a mouth full of sharp, gleaming teeth. And it was on two legs. I stumbled, nearly falling as my foot caught on a root. My flashlight swung wildly, casting erratic beams of light as I scrambled to stay upright. But I didn't stop running. I couldn't. I didn't have time to think, to process what I was seeing. I just knew that I had to get away. I could hear it behind me now, its breathing, deep, guttural, almost growling with each exhale. It was gaining on me. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were about to give out, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I had to make it back to the trailhead. If I could get to my truck, I'd be safe. I just had to keep running. But the thing, whatever it was, wasn't giving up. I could hear it getting closer, its footsteps crashing through the trees, its low growl echoing in my ears. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw it just beyond the reach of my light. its eyes locked on me, its long, clawed hands reaching out like it was toying with me, waiting for the moment to strike. The trailhead was just ahead now, the wooden sign barely visible through the trees. I pushed myself harder, legs screaming in protest, my vision narrowing to a tunnel of light as I focused on the only thing that mattered, getting out. I burst into the clearing where I'd parked my truck, my legs almost giving out beneath me. I fumbled with my keys, shaking so hard I could barely fit them into the lock. The howling stopped, but I knew it was still out there, watching me. Finally, I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, gravel spraying as I tore out of the lot, not daring to look back. It wasn't until I was halfway down the mountain, the headlights illuminating the empty road ahead, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands were still shaking, and my heart pounded in my chest. But I was alive, I was safe. Whatever that thing was, it hadn't followed me down the mountain. I don't go hiking at night anymore. Not after that, and I never will again. Because I don't care what anyone says. The stories are real. There are things out there in the woods, things that shouldn't exist, and I came way too close to one of them. Story 8. The radio crackled to life, breaking the eerie silence of the forest. This is Sierra Team. We've found the campsite. It's... Jesus Christ, you need to see this. My name is Jack Hawkins, and I've been with Search and Rescue for 15 years. I've seen my fair share of tragedy in these woods, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that day. It was supposed to be a routine mission. A group of 4 campers had failed to return from a weekend trip in the Cascade Mountains. Family members reported them missing when they didn't show up for work on Monday. Standard procedure. We'd go in, find them probably a little embarrassed about getting lost, and lead them back to civilization. How wrong we were. Our team of 6 set out at dawn, the cool mountain air nipping at our faces as we loaded our gear into the trucks. I remember thinking it was a beautiful day for a hike, the kind of crisp autumn morning that makes you glad to be alive. If only I'd known what was waiting for us in those woods. We drove as far as we could on the logging roads before setting out on foot. The missing campers' last known location was about 5 miles into the backcountry, near Whispering Pines Lake. It's a popular spot, secluded but not too difficult to reach for experienced hikers. The first few hours of our trek were uneventful. We moved swiftly through the forest, calling out periodically and listening for any response. The only sounds were our own voices echoing back at us and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. It was mid-afternoon when we approached the lake. That's when things started to feel off. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if every living thing was holding its breath, waiting for something. You feel that? My partner, Sarah, whispered beside me. I nodded, my hand instinctively moving to the holster at my hip. 15 years in these mountains had taught me to trust my instincts, and right now every nerve in my body was screaming that something was very, very wrong. We pressed on, following the trail that led to the campers' designated site. As we rounded a bend, the lake came into view, its surface like a mirror reflecting the cloudy sky above, and there, at the water's edge, we saw the first signs of the camp. Sierra Team to base, I radioed in. We've located the campsite, moving in to investigate. As we approached, the wrongness of the scene became apparent. The tents were still standing, but they were wrong, shredded, as if something had torn through them like tissue paper. Personal belongings were scattered across the ground, backpacks emptied, sleeping bags ripped to shreds. "What the hell happened here?" muttered Mike, our team's medic, as he crouched to examine a torn jacket. That's when Sarah called out from near the tree line, "Guys, you need to see this!" We hurried over, and I felt my blood run cold at what I saw. There, leading away from the campsite into the dense forest, was a trail of destruction. Broken branches, gouged earth, and blood. dark splatters staining the leaves and ground. "Sierra team to base," I said into the radio, my voice shakier than I'd like to admit. "We've got signs of violence at the campsite. No victims located yet. Requesting backup and forensics team." The response was immediate. "Copy that. Sierra team. Backup is en route. Proceed with caution." We spread out, following the trail of devastation. The blood splatters became more frequent, larger. Whatever had happened here, it was brutal. After about 100 yards, we found the first body, or what was left of it. The victim, I couldn't even tell if it was male or female, had been torn apart. Limbs were scattered across the forest floor, the torso ripped open. I've seen bear attacks before. This wasn't that. The violence here was on a whole different level. "Oh, God!" Sarah choked out, turning away from the gruesome scene. We pressed on, our movements now cautious, every sense on high alert. The trail led us deeper into the forest, away from any marked paths. The trees here were old, massive trunks blocking out much of the sunlight. We found the second and third victims about a quarter-mile further in. Their condition was similar to the first, brutally mauled, bodies torn apart. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. The way the bodies were positioned, it almost looked deliberate, like they had been arranged. "What kind of animal does this?" Mike whispered, his face pale. I shook my head, unable to form an answer, because deep down, I was starting to suspect that whatever did this wasn't an animal. At least, not any animal we knew. The light was starting to fade as we pushed deeper into the forest. We should have turned back, waited for backup, but we had one camper still unaccounted for. If there was any chance they were still alive, we had to press on. That's when we heard it. A sound that didn't belong in these woods. A sound that made my heart race and my palms sweat. It was a howl, but not like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. This was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that sent chills down my spine. We froze, eyes darting between the deepening shadows. The howl came again, closer this time, and then another answered it, from a different direction. "We need to get out of here," Sarah hissed, her hand tight on her rifle. I nodded, keying my radio. "Sierra team to base. We're aborting the mission. There's something out here. We need immediate evac." Static was my only answer. "Sierra team to base. Do you copy?" Nothing. "Shit," I muttered. "Okay, team, let's move. Back to the lake. Double time." We started to retreat, moving as quickly and quietly as we could through the darkening forest. The howls continued, seeming to come from all around us now, and there were other sounds too, heavy footfalls, branches snapping under significant weight. We were about halfway back to the lake when Mike let out a strangled cry. I spun around just in time to see him yanked into the underbrush, his scream cut short by a sickening crunch. "Run!" I yelled, all pretense of stealth abandoned. We ran, blind panic driving us forward. The sounds of pursuit were all around us now, crashing through the forest, those terrible howls growing ever closer. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish chase. But suddenly, mercifully, we burst out of the tree line onto the shore of the lake. "The boats!" Sarah gasped, pointing to a pair of canoes pulled up on the shore. They must have belonged to the campers. We sprinted for them, the sounds of our pursuers growing louder by the second. I chanced to look back as I reached the water's edge and immediately wished I hadn't. There, at the edge of the clearing, were things, massive, fur-covered bodies, standing upright on two legs. Their faces were a horrifying blend of human and wolf, yellow eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more hidden in the shadows. We shoved the canoes into the water, scrambling in as the creatures let out a chorus of bone-chilling howls. They charged toward us, covering ground with terrifying speed. Sarah and I paddled with desperate strength, driving the canoe out onto the lake. I felt something grab at the back of the boat, nearly capsizing us, but then we were beyond their reach. We didn't stop paddling until we reached the far shore, our arms burning with exertion. As we pulled the canoe up onto land, I looked back across the lake. The creatures were still there, pacing the shoreline. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of their gaze. It took us hours to find our way back to the trucks, moving as quietly as we could through the pitch-black forest. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us jumping, certain that those things were right behind us. When we finally reached civilization and got in touch with base, they told us no backup had ever been sent. They never received our calls for help. The forensics team they sent out the next day found no trace of the carnage we'd witnessed. No bodies, no blood, no shredded campsite. Nothing. Sarah and I were the only survivors of our 6-person team. We told them everything, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes. They chalked it up to a bear attack, said we must have been confused by the trauma, but I know what I saw. Those weren't bears. They weren't anything that should exist in this world. I don't go into the woods anymore. I can't, because I know they're out there waiting. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear howling in the distance, a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, predators that see us as nothing more than prey, and they're hungry. Story 9. The footprints by the river weren't human. That much was obvious from the moment I saw them. They were too big, too deep, and the stride was all wrong. But it wasn't just the size of them that chilled me to the bone. It was what they suggested. Something had been here, something huge, and whatever it was still out there. It started off like any other family camping trip. My wife Sarah, our daughter Lily, and I had packed up the car and headed to a remote campground near a river we'd been to a few times before. We wanted a weekend to unplug. No cell service, no work emails, just nature and each other. The spot we found was perfect, tucked away from the more popular campgrounds, right near the riverbank, where Lily could splash around while Sarah and I relaxed by the fire. We set up camp without any trouble. The weather was perfect, the sun bright but not too hot, and the forest around us felt alive. Birds chirped from the canopy above, and the river babbled quietly as it wound through the rocks. It was the kind of peace you can't get in the city, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes you forget about everything else. By the time the sun started setting, we were sitting around the campfire, roasting marshmallows while Lily giggled, her face sticky with melted chocolate from her s'mores. It was one of those moments that felt almost too perfect, like a snapshot of happiness. I should have known something was wrong when the forest went quiet. One moment, the air was filled with the hum of insects, the distant croak of frogs, the rustle of leaves in the wind. The next, it was like someone had hit a mute button on the world. Sarah noticed it too, her eyes flicking toward the trees with a worried frown. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, trying to play it off like it was no big deal. Probably just the animals settling down for the night. But the truth was, it wasn't just quiet, it was dead quiet. No wind, no frogs, no birds, nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and the river flowing nearby. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. We put Lily to bed, a little earlier than usual, tucking her into the tent with her favorite stuffed animal. She fell asleep almost instantly, worn out from the excitement of the day. Sarah and I sat by the fire for a while longer, talking in hushed tones, though neither of us really acknowledged the silence that pressed in from the woods. Eventually, the uneasy feeling became too much, and I suggested we turn in for the night. Sarah agreed, though she kept glancing toward the tree line as if expecting something to come out of the darkness. I woke up sometime after midnight. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. The fire had long since died out, leaving the campsite cloaked in darkness. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the river, and the air was cold enough to make me pull my sleeping bag tighter around me. I lay there for a minute, listening. That's when I heard it. A faint splash, like something stepping into the water. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake Sarah or Lily, and listened. Another splash, closer this time, followed by a soft, deliberate crunch of gravel on the riverbank. I reached for the flashlight at the side of the tent, my pulse quickening. I didn't know what I was expecting to find out there, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But the unease I'd felt earlier returned in full force, crawling up my spine as I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The air outside was cold, and the night seemed impossibly still. The moonlight reflected off the river, casting a ghostly glow over the water and the rocks. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, just the river and the trees. But then I saw them, the footprints. They were enormous, each one at least twice the size of my own foot, pressed deep into the soft gravel near the water's edge. They led away from the river, disappearing into the dense forest beyond the campsite. My heart hammered in my chest as I knelt down to get a closer look. The prints were fresh. Whatever had made them had walked through here only moments ago. The toes were long, splayed out like those of an animal, but the stride, it wasn't right. The spacing between each step was too long, too measured, like something walking on two legs. I stood up, scanning the trees with my flashlight again, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The woods were still quiet, too quiet, and suddenly I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. That something was out there watching me. I backed toward the tent, my eyes never leaving the tree line. I didn't want to turn my back on the woods, didn't want to give whatever it was the chance to. A branch snapped, loud and sharp. From somewhere just beyond the range of my flashlight, I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Another snap, closer this time, followed by a low, almost imperceptible growl. It was deep, guttural, more like the rumble of a bear. But bears don't walk on two legs. I took a step back, my legs trembling, every instinct screaming at me to get back inside the tent. Whatever was out there, it was big. Bigger than anything I'd ever encountered in the woods before. Suddenly, something moved at the edge of the trees. A massive, dark shape, just barely visible in the shadows. My flashlight flicked over it, and for a split second I saw it. It was tall, easily over 8 feet, standing on two legs with broad, powerful shoulders covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but I caught a glimpse of its eyes, glowing faintly in the moonlight, watching me. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to get back to the tent. I threw myself inside, zipping it up as quickly and quietly as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. Sarah stirred, blinking groggily. "What's wrong?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "I think something's out there," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Something big." She sat up, her eyes wide with alarm. "What do you mean?" I didn't answer. Instead, I listened, my body tense, every muscle coiled like a spring. Outside, the night was still eerily quiet, but I could feel it, that presence. It was still out there, somewhere just beyond the campsite, waiting. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, barely daring to breathe. Every now and then, I thought I heard the faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel, but I couldn't be sure. It was like the creature was circling us, staying just out of sight. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale, pink light over the forest. The sense of dread that had hung over the campsite all night had lifted, replaced by the familiar sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze. I unzipped the tent cautiously, stepping out into the morning light. The footprints were still there, clear as day, leading from the river and disappearing into the woods. But whatever had made them was gone. Sarah joined me a moment later, her face pale as she stared at the tracks. "What the hell?" "I don't know," I muttered, shaking my head, "but we're leaving now." We packed up camp in record time, neither of us saying much as we loaded up the car. Lily was still half asleep, oblivious to what had happened during the night. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see that dark figure watching us again, but the forest remained quiet. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd come dangerously close to something we weren't supposed to see, something that didn't want us there. I've been camping my whole life. I've seen bears, wolves, even mountain lions. But whatever I saw that night by the river wasn't any of those things, and I'll never forget the way it looked at me, like it was deciding whether or not to let us go. We were lucky, I'm sure of that, but I won't be going back to that campsite ever again. Story 10. I never knew silence could be so loud until that night in the tent. The quiet was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat and the heavy footsteps circling outside. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, praying to whatever God might be listening that the thin fabric of my tent would somehow protect me from the monster lurking just inches away. My name is Tom, and I've been an avid solo camper for years. There's something about the solitude of the wilderness that always called to me, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life and reconnect with nature. I'd spent countless nights alone in the backcountry, falling asleep to the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that moonless night in the Adirondacks. It was supposed to be a routine 3-day trek, a chance to clear my head and test out some new ultralight gear. I'd chosen a remote trail, one that saw little traffic even in peak season. In late October, I was banking on having the wilderness entirely to myself. The first day went smoothly. The autumn colors were in full glory, painting the landscape in vibrant reds and golds. I made good time, covering about 15 miles before setting up camp in a small clearing near a babbling brook. As I sat by my small campfire that evening, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, I felt that familiar sense of peace wash over me. This was where I belonged. If only I'd known it would be my last moment of true calm for a long time to come. I turned in early, eager to get a fresh start in the morning. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I snuggled deep into my sleeping bag, listening to the soothing sound of the nearby stream. Sleep came quickly. I'm not sure what exactly woke me. It might have been a sound, or perhaps just that primal instinct that tells you when you're being watched. But suddenly, I was wide awake, every nerve in my body on high alert. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The brook that had been my lullaby earlier was now eerily quiet, as if the water itself was holding its breath. No insects chirped, no leaves rustled. It was the kind of unnatural quiet that only happens in the wilderness when a predator is near, and then I heard it. A soft crunch of leaves just outside my tent. My first thought was bear, and I mentally ran through the proper procedures. Stay still. Make noise if it gets too close. Fight back if it attacks. But as I lay there, scarcely breathing, I realized this was no bear. The footsteps were too deliberate, too bipedal. Whatever was out there was walking on 2 legs. A person, maybe. But who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling so badly I could barely grip it. Should I turn it on, try to scare away whatever was out there, or would the light just draw its attention? Before I could decide, the footsteps stopped, right next to my tent. I could hear breathing now, deep and ragged, like an animal that's just finished a long chase. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized whatever it was massive. The breathing was coming from a point well above where a person's head would be. I lay there, frozen in terror, as the creature began to circle my tent. Slow, methodical steps, each one sending vibrations through the ground. It was so close I could hear the rustle of fur against the tent fabric. Minutes passed, like hours, as it continued its circuit. 3 times it circled, each round ratcheting up my fear another notch. I wanted to scream, to leap up and run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped in a paralysis of pure, primal fear. On the 4th pass, it stopped again by the tent entrance. There was a moment of terrible stillness, and then a sniffing sound. Long, deep inhalations. It was scenting me, I realized with dawning horror. Whatever this thing was, it knew I was in here. It was deciding whether I was prey. A low growl rumbled through the night, so deep I felt it in my chest more than heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, something from the depths of our darkest prehistoric nightmares. And then, without warning, claws ripped through the tent fabric. I'd like to say I reacted with courage, that I fought back or at least tried to escape. But the truth is, in that moment of sheer terror, I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. I just lay there, watching in horrified fascination as those claws, each easily the length of my hand, shredded through the tent like it was tissue paper. A massive, fur-covered arm thrust through the opening, groping blindly in the darkness. I could see muscles rippling under the thick, dark fur. This was no bear. Bears don't have arms that long, that humanoid. The arm withdrew, and for a split second, I dared to hope it was over. But then the entire tent shook as the creature grabbed it from the outside. In one powerful motion, it ripped the tent from its stakes and flung it aside, leaving me exposed to the night, and to the monster that had found me. I'd always scoffed at stories of Bigfoot, dismissed tales of werewolves as campfire fantasies, but the creature looming over me defied any rational explanation. It stood easily 8 feet tall, its body a nightmarish blend of human and beast. Thick fur covered its massive frame, but the proportions were all wrong for any known animal. Long arms ended in hands, tipped with those terrible claws. Its legs were bent oddly, somewhere between a man's and a wolf's, but it was the face that truly paralyzed me with terror. A long, canine-like muzzle filled with gleaming teeth, eyes that glowed an eerie yellow-green in the darkness, filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other, me, tangled in my sleeping bag, unable to move or even think, and the creature, its hot breath misting in the cold night air, regarding me with what I could only describe as hungry curiosity. Suddenly, it threw back its head and let out a howl that shook me to my very core. It was answered by another howl in the distance, and then another. There were more of them out there. That's what finally broke me out of my paralysis. With a desperate strength I didn't know I possessed, I clawed my way out of the sleeping bag and ran. I didn't bother with shoes or supplies. I just ran blindly into the dark forest, branches whipping at my face, rocks cutting into my bare feet. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its powerful strides easily keeping pace with my panicked flight. The sound of its pursuit was joined by others, coming from different directions. They were herding me, I realized with a fresh wave of terror. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that nightmarish chase. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't dare stop, because I knew that the moment I did, those claws would be upon me. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, the trees thinned out and I burst onto a road, an actual paved road. The sudden transition from wilderness to civilization was so jarring I nearly fell. Headlights appeared in the distance, and I stumbled into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The pickup truck screeched to a halt, just short of hitting me. "Jesus Christ, son, what happened to you?" the old man behind the wheel exclaimed as I scrambled into the passenger seat. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a barely coherent stream. Creature, claws, chase. But even as I spoke, I could see the disbelief in his eyes. And when I looked back at the forest line, there was nothing there. No glowing eyes, no hulking shadows, just the quiet, dark woods. The old man drove me to the nearest town, probably thinking I was drunk or on drugs. I called the police, gave them my statement. They searched the area where I'd been camping but found nothing. No shredded tent, no monstrous footprints, nothing to corroborate my wild story. That was 5 years ago. I haven't been camping since. Hell, I can barely bring myself to walk through a city park because I know the truth now. I know what's really out there, hiding in the dark spaces of the world. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear howling in the distance. And I wonder, are they still out there, waiting? And what happens when they decide to leave the forest behind? Story 11. The Pine Barrens are the kind of place that make you feel small. The trees stretch out in every direction like an endless maze, and when the sun goes down, it's like stepping into another world, one where the shadows move, and the quiet isn't just peaceful, it's unsettling. I'd been a park ranger out there for 3 years, and I thought I'd seen it all, but I was wrong. That night, the night I went looking for the missing campers, I learned that there's something far worse than getting lost in those woods. The call came in just as the sun was setting, the last of the light fading from the sky and leaving the forest bathed in deep purple shadows. It was supposed to be an easy shift, just routine patrols through the quieter sections of the pine barrens. Nothing ever happened out there, not really. A few lost hikers now and then, some kids trying to scare each other with stories about the Jersey Devil, but this call was different. A group of campers had gone missing. They'd set up in a part of the Barrens that wasn't on the official map, a secluded area no one had any business being in. The dispatcher said their friends reported them missing after hearing strange noises over a phone call that cut off abruptly. Probably just some kids pulling a prank, I muttered to myself as I grabbed my gear and headed for the truck. Still, something about the tone of the dispatcher's voice bothered me. There was an edge of real concern. The kind you don't hear when it's just a bunch of drunk kids wandering off after too many beers. The drive to the location took about 30 minutes, but once I got out there, I had to leave the truck behind and hike the rest of the way in on foot. The trail was barely visible, more of a narrow deer path winding between thick stands of pines and tangled underbrush. The further I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the soft crunch of my boots on the pine needles. I don't know when the feeling started, but somewhere along the way, I began to sense that I wasn't alone. It was subtle at first, just a prickling at the back of my neck, the kind of feeling you get when someone's watching you. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the trees stretching on and on into the dark. I reached the campsite just as the last light faded from the sky. The fire pit was cold, and the tents were still there, but they'd been ripped open like something or someone had torn through them with claws. Gear was scattered everywhere, backpacks, sleeping bags, half-eaten food. It looked like they'd left in a hurry. I tried to radio back to the station, but the signal was weak out here, and all I got was static. Great. I figured I'd look around. Maybe they hadn't gone far. Maybe they'd just spooked themselves and run off, waiting for someone to come find them. But the deeper I looked, the more it became clear they hadn't run. They'd been chased. I found the first set of tracks about 20 yards from the campsite. Huge, deep impressions in the ground, almost like a dog's paw prints, but much, much larger. I crouched down, shining my flashlight on them, and my stomach tightened. There was something wrong with the shape. It wasn't just the size, it was the way the toes splayed out, wide and clawed, like something that wasn't used to walking on 2 legs had tried to. I followed the tracks into the woods, my heart starting to race. Every instinct told me to turn around, get back to the truck, and forget about this. But I couldn't. I had a job to do, and there were people missing. Still, the further I went, the more I regretted not turning back. The prints led deeper into the forest, away from any trails, weaving between the trees in erratic patterns. The underbrush was thick, and more than once I found broken branches, as though something huge had barreled through. The night was fully upon me now, and the darkness felt thick, suffocating. My flashlight was the only thing keeping the shadows at bay, but it felt like it wasn't enough. That's when I heard the first sound, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill racing down my spine. It wasn't far. I swung the flashlight in the direction of the noise, heart pounding in my ears, but all I saw were the endless trees, their branches swaying slightly in a breeze that didn't touch the ground. I called out, my voice hoarse. "Hello? Anyone out there? Ranger here? Just looking for the campers." Silence. And then, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, I saw something move, a shadow, tall and massive, slipping between the trees with an eerie, unnatural grace. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. For a moment I thought maybe it was a bear, a big one, but bears don't move like that, and they definitely don't stand on two legs. I took a step back, trying to keep the light trained on the spot where I'd seen the shadow, but it was gone. The forest was still again, but I knew that something was out there. The growl came again, this time closer. My body tensed, and I started backing away, my mind racing through the options. I had no gun, no backup, and no clear idea of what I was dealing with. The tracks, the torn tents, the strange noises, it all pointed to something I didn't want to believe, something that shouldn't exist. I turned and started walking quickly back toward the campsite, trying to keep calm. Whatever it was, I didn't want to provoke it. I'd seen enough to know that this was way beyond anything I'd signed up for. My job was to keep people safe, but I couldn't do that if I ended up like the missing campers. And that's when I heard the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I broke into a run, branches snapping beneath my boots as I tore through the underbrush. I could hear it behind me now, crashing through the trees like something massive, something fast. I didn't dare look back. The campsite came into view, the remnants of the torn tents flickering in the beam of my flashlight. I skidded to a stop, my breath ragged, scanning the area for any sign of the campers. There was nothing, just the empty, shredded remains of their gear. And then, from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, it stepped out. The creature was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its head was like a wolf's, but the body was wrong, too muscular, too human-like. Its eyes gleamed yellow in the light, and its lips curled back in a snarl, revealing sharp, glistening teeth. It was a dogman, the kind of creature you hear about in old legends, in stories passed down by locals, but never actually believe is real. Until you're standing face to face with one, it took a step toward me, its growl deepening, the sound reverberating through the still air. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the impossible thing in front of me, knowing that I was completely and utterly outmatched. The dogman took another step, and that broke the spell. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I sprinted toward the trail. The sound of the creature's footsteps thunderous behind me. It was faster than me, gaining ground with terrifying speed. I crashed through the trees, branches whipping at my face, my lungs screaming for air. I could hear it, just behind me, its growls growing louder, closer. I was almost to the truck, just a few more yards. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could feel its presence, feel the weight of its gaze on my back, but I kept running. Finally, the truck came into view, parked at the edge of the trail. I lunged for the door, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it just as the dogman burst from the trees, its eyes glowing in the beam of my headlights. It didn't come closer. It just stood there, watching me, its breath fogging in the cold night air. And then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared back into the woods, leaving me shaking and breathless in the cab of the truck. I radioed back to the station as soon as I could, my voice trembling. They sent a search team out the next morning, but we never found the campers. Just their ripped tents and the same massive tracks I'd seen the night before. I don't patrol that part of the Pine Barrens anymore. I don't go out there at night, and I never will again. Story 12. The deer carcass shouldn't have been up there, 15 feet off the ground, wedged in the fork of an ancient oak, its glassy eyes staring accusingly at us. That's when we knew something was terribly wrong in these woods. I'm Jake, and my buddy Mike and I have been fishing partners for over a decade. We're both in our mid-30s, weekend warriors escaping the grind of city life whenever we can. This particular trip was supposed to be a simple overnight excursion to Blackwater River, a spot we'd visited countless times before. We thought we knew these woods like the backs of our hands. We were wrong. It started normally enough. We arrived at our usual parking spot just after dawn on a crisp Saturday morning in late September. The air had that perfect fall bite to it, and the leaves were just starting to turn. As we shouldered our packs and grabbed our rods, Mike turned to me with a grin. "First one to catch a trout doesn't have to cook dinner," he challenged. I laughed, already tasting victory. "I hope you brought your apron then, buddy." We set off down the familiar trail, the sounds of the forest welcoming us back. Birds called from the canopy, and occasionally we'd hear the rustle of some small animal darting through the underbrush. The first mile or so was uneventful, just two friends enjoying nature and each other's company. It was about an hour into our hike when we first noticed something odd. The trail, which should have been well worn from years of use, seemed different. Overgrown in places, with fallen branches we had to clamber over. We chalked it up to a busy ranger service and pressed on. As we got deeper into the woods, though, an uneasy feeling started to creep over me. The bird calls had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of our own footsteps. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving the forest unnaturally still. "Hey, Mike," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Does something feel off to you?" He paused, looking around with a frown. "Now that you mention it, yeah. It's too quiet." We pressed on, but now we were both on high alert, eyes scanning the surrounding forest for, well, we weren't sure what. That's when we saw the tracks. At first glance, they looked almost human. 2 legs, bipedal gait, but they were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, and at the end of each toe was a clear impression of a claw. "What the hell made those?" Mike whispered, crouching down to examine them more closely. I shook my head, a chill running down my spine despite the warm afternoon sun. "I don't know, man. Maybe a bear standing up," but we both knew that wasn't right. Bears don't walk on 2 legs for any distance, and these tracks continued straight down the path as far as we could see. We should have turned back then. Every instinct was screaming at us to get out of these woods, but curiosity, and if I'm honest, a bit of macho bravado, pushed us forward. We had to know what made those tracks. As we followed the trail of footprints, the forest around us seemed to change. The trees grew older, more gnarled. Mist began to curl around our ankles. Despite the afternoon warmth, an oppressive silence settled over everything, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig beneath our feet. That's when we found the deer. We rounded a bend in the trail, and there it was, suspended in the branches of a massive oak tree. It was a young buck, its antlers tangled in the smaller branches, but it wasn't the location that froze us in our tracks. It was the condition of the carcass. The deer had been hollowed out. Its rib cage was splayed open, organs removed with surgical precision. Yet there was barely any blood. It was as if something had carefully dissected the animal, then deliberately placed it in the tree. "Jesus Christ," Mike breathed, his face pale. "What could have done this?" Before I could answer, we heard it. A sound that didn't belong in these woods, or anywhere in the natural world. It was a cross between a howl and a scream, high-pitched yet guttural, echoing through the trees, and it was close. We ran, all thoughts of fishing or camping forgotten. We just ran. Branches whipped at our faces, roots seemed to reach up to trip us, but we didn't slow down, because behind us we could hear something crashing through the underbrush, something big. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that panicked flight, but suddenly, mercifully, we burst out of the tree line onto the shore of the river. The sound of rushing water had never been so welcome. "The boat!" Mike gasped, pointing to a small rowboat pulled up on the bank. It must have belonged to another fishing party. We didn't hesitate. We shoved the boat into the water and scrambled in, using our hands to paddle frantically when we couldn't find any oars. The current caught us, pulling us swiftly downstream. As we rounded a bend, I chanced a look back at the shore. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. There, at the edge of the water, stood something. It was tall, at least 7 feet. covered in pale, slimy-looking skin. Its body was emaciated, ribs clearly visible, but powerfully built. Long arms ended in hands tipped with wicked claws. But its face, God, its face was like nothing I'd ever seen. No nose, just 2 slits where it should have been. A mouth that seemed too wide for its head, filled with needle-sharp teeth, and its eyes, huge, bulbous things that reflected the fading light like a cat's. For a moment that felt like an eternity, it stared at us. Then it opened its mouth and let out that terrible howl scream we'd heard before. The sound seemed to pierce right through me, setting every nerve on fire with primal terror. And then, mercifully, the river carried us around another bend, and the creature was lost from sight. We didn't stop paddling until we reached a small town downriver, our arms burning with exertion. As we stumbled onto the shore, babbling our story to bewildered locals, I realized with dawning horror that our ordeal might not be over, because I'd seen something else on that riverbank just before we lost sight of the creature. Footprints in the mud, human footprints leading away from the water. Whatever that thing was, it could leave the forest. It could follow us. The police were called, of course. Search parties were sent out. But they found nothing. No tracks, no mutilated deer, not even our abandoned camping gear. It was as if the forest had swallowed all evidence of our encounter. Most people didn't believe us. They chalked it up to a bear encounter, or maybe some hardcore survivalists playing a prank. But Mike and I know the truth. We saw what was out there, what's probably still out there. I don't go fishing anymore. Hell, I can barely bring myself to walk through a city park, because now I know that the line between our world and whatever else is out there is thinner than we think. And sometimes things cross over. Every now and then I'll see a news report about strange animal attacks or hikers gone missing in those woods, and I'll wonder if it's happening again, if that thing is still out there, hunting, waiting. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear a sound drifting from the direction of the forest. A howl that's not quite animal, not quite human. A reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Things that are hungry. Story 13. There's something about being alone on a mountain ridge that makes you feel invincible. The air is thin. The world spread out below you like it's yours to command, and for a brief moment you believe nothing can touch you. But that night, standing on the ridge with the wind howling in my ears and the stars stretched out above me, I realized how small I really was, and how easily something out there could reach up and pull me into the dark. It had been a perfect hike up until then. I'd planned to spend a couple of nights solo camping in one of the more remote areas of the Pacific Northwest, a place I'd hiked a dozen times before. The isolation was part of the draw. No tourists, no noisy hikers, just me and the mountain. It was late September, so the weather was cool, but not cold, and the trail up to the ridge was challenging enough to make me feel like I'd earned the solitude once I got to the top. I'd set up camp just below the ridgeline, in a small clearing protected from the wind, with a stunning view of the valley below. The sunset had been breathtaking, and now, as the last of the light faded, the stars began to emerge one by one. It was peaceful up there, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional rustle of trees in the distance. The world felt vast and empty, like I was the only person on Earth. After finishing dinner, I banked the fire and zipped myself into my sleeping bag, lying on top of a ground mat just outside my tent. I wasn't ready to turn in yet. Besides, the sky was too clear, the stars too bright to miss. I loved nights like this. It was why I came out here in the first place. No distractions, no noise, just the quiet hum of the mountain. But something felt off. I didn't notice it at first. It was subtle, like a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the sudden drop in temperature or the way the wind seemed to die all at once, leaving the night unnervingly still. But as I lay there, staring up at the sky, that uneasy feeling grew, curling itself into my gut. Then I heard it, This soft, distant sound, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. It was a low, rumbling grunt, almost like the growl of an animal, but it wasn't close. At least I told myself it wasn't close. I sat up slowly, scanning the tree line just beyond my camp with my flashlight. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting long, skeletal shadows on the ground. I didn't see anything out of place, but the feeling persisted, like something was out there, just beyond the edge of the light, watching. "Probably a bear," I muttered under my breath. I'd seen them before on hikes, even had a few close calls, but they were usually just as eager to avoid me as I was to avoid them. Still, I reached for the bear spray, clipped to the side of my pack, and set it beside me, just in case. For a while nothing happened. The night was quiet again, the wind picking up just enough to rustle the branches overhead. I lay back down, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. After all, it was easy to spook yourself when you were alone on a mountain in the dark. But then I heard the sound again, this time closer. I sat up, my heart pounding now, and turned my headlamp on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the rocky outcroppings, the sparse underbrush. Nothing moved. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The sound was real, and whatever was making it was getting closer. I stood up, holding the bear spray in one hand and shining the light into the darkness with the other. "Hey!" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. "If anyone's out there, this is private property. You shouldn't be here." Silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, that makes the air feel thick and heavy, like the world is holding its breath. And then, from somewhere deep in the woods, a rock flew through the air, crashing into the ground just a few feet from where I stood. My blood ran cold. Bears didn't throw rocks. No animal I knew of did. I backed toward the tent, my heart racing, my flashlight scanning the trees frantically. Something was out there. Something big. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized just how alone I was up here, miles from the nearest road, no one to call for help. Another rock flew, this one landing even closer, and with it came a deep, guttural roar, a sound so primal, so powerful that it rattled my bones. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the cliffs, and I swear I could feel the ground tremble beneath me. I turned, grabbing my pack and throwing it into the tent, trying to stay calm. My hands shook as I zipped up the tent flap, fumbling to get the fabric closed. I knew a tent wouldn't protect me from whatever was out there, but at least it would give me a barrier, a sense of security, however false. As I huddled inside, clutching the bear spray, I listened. The roaring stopped, but the night was anything but quiet. I could hear the heavy thud of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. Something was moving just beyond the edge of the clearing, pacing back and forth, circling the camp. It wasn't in a hurry. It knew I wasn't going anywhere. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was still again, and I almost dared to hope that whatever it was had left. But then I heard it, a low, heavy breathing, just outside the tent, close. Too close. I held my breath, praying that it wouldn't come any closer, that it would move on. But then the tent fabric moved, ever so slightly, as something pressed against it from the outside. A shadow loomed over me, massive and hulking, blocking out the faint moonlight. The air was thick with the stench of wet fur and earth, and I could hear it, whatever it was, sniffing, as if it was trying to figure out what I was. My pulse pounded in my ears, my body frozen in place. I squeezed the can of bear spray so hard my knuckles turned white, ready to use it, but terrified of what might happen if I did. The thing outside shifted, its hand, if you could call it a hand, dragging down the side of the tent with a soft scraping sound. The claws caught on the fabric, pulling it tight for a moment before letting go. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it moved away, the heavy footsteps fading into the trees. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat there for what felt like hours, my entire body tense, waiting for it to come back. But the footsteps grew quieter, more distant, until finally the night was silent again. I don't know how long I stayed like that, crouched in my tent, too scared to move. The sun was starting to rise when I finally dared to unzip the flap and peek outside. The campsite was empty, but the evidence was everywhere. Large footprints, too big to be human, pressed deep into the dirt, leading from the tree line and circling my camp. The rocks that had been thrown were scattered across the ground, their size far too large for any person to have tossed them. I packed up camp in record time, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my pack. I didn't care how heavy it was or how far I had to hike to get back to my truck. I wasn't staying another second up there. As I descended the ridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump, my heart racing in my chest, but I never saw it again. Whatever it was, it had let me go. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was Sasquatch, like the stories I'd heard but never believed. Maybe it was something else, something we don't have a name for yet. All I know is that it was real, and I'm never going back to that ridge. Story 14. The claw marks were too high. That was the first sign. Something was terribly wrong in Blackwood National Forest. No bear, no matter how large, could have left gouges 15 feet up a tree trunk. And when I heard my name being called from the depths of the forest, in that guttural, inhuman voice, I knew I was dealing with something beyond the realm of normal wildlife. My name is Sarah Reeves, and I've been a forest ranger at Blackwood for the better part of a decade. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand, every trail, every clearing, every animal that called this place home. But in the span of one terrifying night, everything I thought I knew was turned upside down. It started with reports from hikers about aggressive animal behavior. Nothing too unusual at first. A few close encounters with unusually bold coyotes, some damaged campsites that looked like bear activity. But as the reports increased in frequency and intensity, a pattern began to emerge that set off alarm bells in my mind. The incidents were all concentrated in the northeast section of the park, an area we call the Old Growth. It's a part of the forest that's been largely untouched for centuries, filled with massive trees and deep, shadowy ravines. It's always been a bit different from the rest of the park, quieter, older, but now it seemed downright menacing. I decided to investigate personally. Armed with my standard gear, radio, sidearm, first aid kit, I set out just as the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line. The plan was to make a quick sweep of the area, look for any obvious signs of unusual animal activity, and be back before full dark. The forest was unusually quiet as I made my way down the main trail. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional creak of branches in the light breeze. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. About 2 miles in, I found the first set of claw marks. They were on an old oak tree, deep gouges in the bark that started about chest height and went up far above my head. I've seen plenty of bear scratches in my time, but these were different. The spacing was all wrong, too wide for a bear, and they were so deep, whatever made them had to be incredibly powerful. I radioed back to base, reporting what I'd found. "Keep an eye out for any large predators," came the response. "But be careful, Sarah. If you see anything unusual, don't engage. Call for backup immediately." If only I'd heeded that advice. As I pressed deeper into the old growth, the sense of wrongness grew stronger. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Shadows deepened rapidly as night fell, and more than once I thought I saw movement just at the edge of my flashlight beam. Then I found the second set of claw marks. These were even higher up, easily 15 feet off the ground, and they were fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap. Whatever had made them was close. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these woods, or anywhere in the natural world. It started as a low growl, so deep I felt it in my chest more than heard it. Then it changed, morphing into something almost like speech, distorted, guttural, but unmistakably forming words. And it was calling my name. "Sarah!" the voice growled. seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Sarah Reeves!" I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. How did it know my name? What was it? Fight or flight kicked in, and I chose flight. I ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that thing. I could hear it pursuing me, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Branches snapped like twigs as it plowed through the forest. It was fast, far faster than anything that size should be. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I burst into a small clearing. In the center stood an old fire tower, its metal frame silhouetted against the night sky. It was my only chance. I scrambled up the ladder, my hands slipping on the cold metal rungs. I didn't stop until I reached the top platform, gasping for air and fighting back panic. For a moment, all was quiet. Had I lost it? Then I heard the creak of metal below me. It was climbing the tower. I drew my sidearm with shaking hands, aiming it at the top of the ladder. "Stop right there!" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm armed!" The climbing stopped. Then that terrible voice came again, closer now. "Sarah, don't be afraid. We've been waiting for you." "We!" I whispered, a new wave of terror washing over me. As if in answer, howls erupted from the forest below. Not wolf howls, but something wrong. Too deep, too human-like. There were more of them out there. I keyed my radio, desperately calling for backup, but all I got was static. Whatever these things were, they were interfering with the signal. The metal creaked again as the creature resumed its climb. I fired a warning shot, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet night. The thing paused, then let out a sound that might have been a laugh. "Oh, Sarah, your weapons can't hurt us. We are the old ones, the first ones. We've slept for so long, but now we're awake, and we're hungry." Its head appeared over the edge of the platform, and I felt my sanity begin to fray. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every way. Its skin was a sickly pale color, stretched tight over an elongated skull. Its eyes were huge, entirely black, reflecting my flashlight beam like a cat's. But its mouth, God, its mouth was the worst. It split its face in a Glasgow smile, filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. I fired again, emptying my clip into the thing's face. It jerked back, more surprised than hurt. Then it pulled itself onto the platform, its body unfolding to its full height. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with long, gangly limbs that ended in wickedly clawed hands. "That wasn't very nice, Sarah," it said, its voice a wet gurgle. "We just want to talk, to welcome you to the family." I backed away until I hit the railing, the metal cold against my back. What are you?" I managed to choke out. The creature cocked its head, an unsettlingly human gesture. "We are the guardians of this forest, the keepers of old ways, and you, Sarah Reeves, have been chosen." It reached for me with those terrible clawed hands. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end. But then, miraculously, I heard the sound of helicopters approaching. Searchlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing below. The creature hissed, recoiling from the light. "This isn't over, Sarah," it growled. "We'll be waiting. We're always waiting." And then it was gone, leaping from the tower with impossible grace. I caught a glimpse of it loping into the forest on all fours, followed by several other dark shapes. The rescue team found me still huddled on the tower platform, babbling about monsters and old gods. They put it down to shock, maybe hallucinations brought on by some kind of toxic fungus in the old growth. But I know what I saw, what I heard. I quit my job as a ranger the next day. I couldn't bear to go back into those woods, knowing what lurked in the shadows. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear that voice calling my name from the direction of the forest, reminding me that they're still out there, waiting, because that's the thing about old forests. They have long memories, and sometimes they wake up hungry. Story 15. The cold was unbearable, but it wasn't the biting wind or the snow piling up around my broken-down snowmobile that scared me. It was the silence, the kind of silence that felt wrong, even in the vast wilderness. Out there, miles from civilization, I wasn't alone. Something else was with me, something that didn't belong. I'd been in the backcountry for 2 days, tracking wildlife patterns for the research project I'd been working on for months. The northern wilderness was brutal this time of year, endless stretches of snow and ice, the trees skeletal and frozen, but it was beautiful in its isolation. I'd always loved being out there, away from the noise and the stress of everything else. Just me, the animals, and the land, but on that third day, everything went wrong. It started with the snowmobile. One minute, I was gliding over the packed snow, making good time toward the cabin where I planned to stay the night. The next, the engine sputtered and died. I tried restarting it, cursing under my breath, but all I got was a series of choking sounds before it went completely silent. I was miles from the nearest road, and the snow was coming down hard. The wind whipped through the trees, stinging my face and hands as I crouched beside the snowmobile, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The engine was cold, like it had frozen solid in a matter of minutes. I didn't have the tools to fix it. Not out here, not in these conditions. I had 2 options: stay with the snowmobile and hope someone came looking for me, or hike to the cabin and get warm before the storm got worse. The cabin wasn't far, just a couple of miles uphill. I figured I could make it before dark, so I grabbed my pack, double-checked my map, and started walking. The first half-mile was fine. Hard, yes, but manageable. The snow was already knee-deep, and the wind was picking up, but I'd hiked through worse. I kept my head down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, my boots crunching through the snow. The trees around me were tall and spindly, their branches heavy with ice, and the only sound was the wind howling through the woods. But then, as I climbed higher, I noticed something strange. The trees, those massive, ancient pines that had towered over me all day, were thinning out, becoming gnarled and twisted, as if the wind had bent them over time. The snow beneath my boots felt different too, softer, almost like it was sinking beneath me. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, barely audible over the wind, a distant cry, like something caught in the storm. I stopped, straining to hear over the howling gusts. There it was again, a low, wailing sound, like an animal in distress. My heart skipped a beat. It was too far off to tell what it was, but it didn't sound right. The pitch was too high, too unnatural. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself. The cold was getting to me, making me imagine things. I tightened my grip on the straps of my pack and kept walking, but the sound didn't go away. If anything, it got louder, closer. I kept moving, faster now, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The snow was falling heavier, and the sky had taken on a strange, greyish hue, like the storm was closing in around me. Every step felt harder, the snow dragging at my legs, and the wailing sound followed me, echoing through the trees. Suddenly, the path ahead of me disappeared into the fog of snow. My map told me the cabin was just ahead, but I couldn't see it. Everything was white, blinding, swirling white. The cold gnawed at my face, my fingers numb even through my thick gloves. Panic started to creep in. The storm had picked up faster than I expected, and now I was practically blind out here. And then I heard it again, closer this time, the wail. But now it sounded less like an animal. It was higher pitched, drawn out, almost human. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding, and turned slowly toward the sound. The wind howled around me, but the wailing persisted, coming from somewhere just beyond the fog of snow. My flashlight flickered, cutting through the haze, but all I saw were twisted, ice-covered trees, no movement, no figure. But I could feel something. I took a step back, my boots sinking deeper into the snow. Something wasn't right. I had been alone out here for days, but now I felt watched, as though something was out there in the storm, waiting just beyond the edge of my vision. My heart raced as I stumbled forward, the snow crunching beneath my boots, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The cold was seeping into my bones, my muscles screaming with each step. I needed to get to the cabin. I needed shelter. That's when I saw the figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just past the trees, tall, emaciated, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted out unnaturally. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits, and its mouth hung open, the same wailing cry I'd been hearing echoing from its throat. It stood on two legs, hunched and gaunt, its limbs too long, too thin. It didn't move. It just watched. My blood turned to ice. My mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. This thing. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. But there it was, standing in the snow, its head tilting slightly as though it was considering me, deciding whether or not I was worth its time. For a moment, we were both still. I stood frozen in place, my body numb with fear, my mind screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The thing's wail cut through the wind, sharp and high-pitched, and the sound was like nails scraping across my skull. Then, without warning, it started toward me. The way it moved was wrong. It didn't walk so much as glide over the snow, its long, skeletal arms hanging at its sides, its body shifting unnaturally with each step. The ground beneath it seemed to sink as it moved, the snow parting for it like water. I turned and ran. My feet slipped in the snow, my boots barely finding purchase as I stumbled through the drifts. The wind howled in my ears, and the wailing followed me, louder now, closer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, my lungs burning, my legs trembling with every step. I didn't know where I was going. The cabin was somewhere ahead, but the storm had swallowed everything, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, keep running, or that thing would catch me. I could hear it behind me, the crunch of snow, the wail piercing through the wind. It was gaining on me. I wasn't fast enough. My legs felt like lead, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold was suffocating, the snow dragging me down with every step. Then through the haze of snow, I saw it, a small, dark shape, barely visible through the blizzard. The cabin. I pushed myself harder, my heart thundering in my chest, the wailing growing louder in my ears. The door was just ahead. I could make it. I had to make it. I slammed into the door with my shoulder, throwing it open and collapsing inside, gasping for breath. The warmth hit me like a wave, but I didn't stop. I kicked the door shut, bolting it with shaking hands, my entire body trembling with cold and fear. For a moment, the only sound was my ragged breathing. Then from outside, the wailing came again, muffled now but still impossibly close. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my ears. The thing was out there. I knew it was. I could feel it, its presence pressing against the walls of the cabin, its wail cutting through the storm like a knife. But it didn't try to break in. It just stayed. I could hear it pacing outside, moving around the cabin, its footsteps heavy in the snow. Every so often it would stop, and the wailing would begin again, louder, more insistent. I huddled in the corner of the cabin, my back pressed against the wall, the sound of the storm raging outside. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. I don't know how long I stayed like that, listening to the wailing, the sound of it clawing at my mind. The storm raged through the night, but the creature never left. It just waited. Story 16. The moment I saw it standing there, illuminated by our dying campfire, I knew that every scary story we'd told that night paled in comparison to the real monster in front of us. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly intelligence, and as it rose to its full height on two legs, I realized with horrifying clarity that werewolves weren't just the stuff of legend. My name's Alex, and I used to love camping. Used to. That was before the night that changed everything, the night that showed me there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows just beyond the reach of our campfires. It was supposed to be a fun weekend trip, just me and 4 of my closest friends. We'd been planning it for months, a chance to escape the grind of our jobs and reconnect with nature. We chose a remote spot in the Adirondacks, miles from the nearest town or cell signal, the kind of place where you can really feel alone in the wilderness. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping low in the sky as we set up our tents. The spot was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a babbling brook nearby. As darkness fell, we got a fire going and broke out the beers and marshmallows. It was Jake who started the ghost stories. He'd always been the one with a flair for the dramatic, and as the flames cast flickering shadows across his face, he launched into a tale about a haunted cabin not far from where we were camping. They say you can still hear the screams of the family that was murdered there, he finished with a dramatic whisper. We all laughed, more at Jake's over-the-top delivery than any real fear. But there was an undercurrent of tension, that delicious kind of scared that comes from being in the woods at night, surrounded by darkness. "Okay, my turn," said Sarah, leaning forward. Her story was about a group of hikers who disappeared in these very mountains, never to be seen again. As she spoke, I couldn't help but notice how the woods around us seemed to grow quieter, as if listening. We went around the circle, each trying to outdo the last with tales of ghosts, serial killers, and monsters. By the time it got to me, the fire had burned low, and the woods felt alive with imagined terrors. I launched into a story I'd heard as a kid about a werewolf that stalked the Adirondacks. "They say it only comes out on the full moon," I said, glancing up at the bright orb overhead. "It looks for campers who've strayed too far from civilization, picking them off one by one." That's when we heard it, a loud crash in the woods, like something large moving through the underbrush. We all froze, our eyes darting to the darkness beyond the firelight. Probably just a deer," Mike said, but his voice shook slightly. Then came the howl. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't like any wolf howl I'd ever heard. There was something wrong about it, almost human, but twisted, feral. "Okay, very funny, Alex," Sarah said, her nervous laugh betraying her fear. "You can stop now." But I wasn't doing anything. And judging by the looks of terror on my friends' faces, they knew it too. The howl came again, closer this time. It was answered by another, off to our right, then another behind us. We were surrounded. "Get to the tents," I whispered urgently. "Now!" We scrambled up, nearly tripping over each other in our haste. I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of our campsite, something large darting between the trees. We'd just reached the tents when another crash sounded, this one from the direction of our fire. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, we turned around. There, illuminated by the dying embers, stood a creature out of our worst nightmares. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a horrifying blend of man and wolf. Thick, matted fur covered its powerfully muscled frame. Its hands, if you could call them that, ended in wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that froze the scream in my throat. A long, canine snout filled with gleaming teeth, pointed ears that swiveled to catch every sound, and the eyes. God, the eyes. They glowed an eerie yellow-green in the firelight, filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. For a moment that felt like an eternity, it just stood there, regarding us with those impossible eyes. Then it rose to its full height on 2 legs, threw back its head, and let out a howl that shook me to my very core. That broke the spell. We ran, abandoning any thought of supplies or safety, just pure animal panic driving us into the dark woods. I could hear the creatures behind us. Yes, creatures plural. There were more of them, crashing through the underbrush. The sounds of pursuit came from all sides, herding us deeper into the forest. We ran blindly, branches whipping at our faces, roots seeming to reach up to trip us. Sarah went down with a cry of pain, and Mike stopped to help her up. I glanced back just in time to see a dark shape lunge from the shadows. Mike's scream was cut terrifyingly short. "Keep running," I yelled to the others, fighting back the urge to vomit. We couldn't help Mike now. We could only run and pray. I don't know how long we fled through the darkness. Time lost all meaning in that nightmarish chase, but suddenly, mercifully, we burst out onto a road. The sudden transition from wilderness to civilization was so jarring, I nearly fell. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and we waved frantically, screaming for help. The pickup truck screeched to a halt beside us, an old man peering out with concern. "What in tarnation?" he started to say, but I cut him off. "Please, you have to help us," I gasped, already pulling open the passenger door. "There's something out there. It got Mike. We have to go now." Maybe it was the wild look in our eyes, or the genuine terror in our voices, but the old man didn't argue. He threw the truck into gear, and we sped off, tires squealing on the asphalt. As we rounded a bend, I chanced to look back. There, at the edge of the woods, I saw them. 3 massive, wolf-like shapes, standing upright on 2 legs. Their eyes reflected the taillights, glowing red in the darkness. Then we turned another corner, and they were gone. We went straight to the police stud, of course, told them everything. They sent out search parties, found our campsite in disarray. But there was no sign of Mike, no giant wolfmen, just some large canine prints that they attributed to wolves. They chalked it up to a bear attack, said we were lucky to have escaped, told us our minds had played tricks on us in the dark, that fear and adrenaline can make you see things that aren't there. But I know what I saw, what we all saw. It's been 5 years since that night. I haven't been camping since. Can barely bring myself to walk through a city park. Sarah and Jake are the same. We don't talk much anymore. I think we all just want to forget. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I find myself staring out the window, watching the shadows, and I wonder, are they still out there, still hunting? And what happens when they decide to leave the forest behind? Because now I know the truth. The line between our world and the world of monsters is thinner than we think. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is bright and the shadows are long, that line can blur. So if you're ever in the woods at night and you hear a howl that doesn't sound quite right, don't dismiss it as just your imagination. Don't assume it's only a wolf or a coyote, because there are things out there in the dark, things that hunt, things that hunger, and they're watching, always watching. Story 17. The night was so still, I could hear the crackle of the fire from 50 feet away. The air was cold, biting in the way only deep wilderness can be, and the stars above seemed impossibly bright against the black sky. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, nothing more than a quiet night in the woods, maybe a check-in with the locals who lived scattered across the mountain. But when the howls started echoing through the trees, I realized that this night was going to be anything but routine. It had started earlier in the evening. My partner, Dave, and I had been assigned to patrol one of the more isolated sections of the park, deep in the thick forest that stretched for miles without any roads. We'd driven in on one of the old dirt paths, just wide enough for the truck, and parked near a clearing that we used as a base for these overnight patrols. There'd been reports of strange animal activity, livestock killed, and a few sightings of large, wolf-like creatures. The locals chalked it up to a pack of wolves or maybe a bear, but something about the reports didn't sit right with me. Wolves didn't leave livestock half-eaten, and bears didn't roam in packs. We'd set up camp as the sun dipped low, our fire small but enough to keep us warm. The plan was simple: stay the night, do a few sweeps through the woods, and head back in the morning. I'd done this 100 times before, and usually the night was quiet. But there was something different about tonight, something I couldn't quite place. The air felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath, and the quiet was too deep, almost unnatural. Dave was sitting by the fire, his face lit by the flickering flames. He was the kind of guy who didn't get rattled easily. He'd been a park ranger for longer than I'd been out of school, and there wasn't much that could shake him. But even he seemed on edge that night. Every few minutes he'd look up from his thermos of coffee and scan the tree line. His eyes narrowed. "You feel that?" he asked, breaking the silence. I nodded. not really knowing what I was agreeing to, but feeling the same unease. Yeah, something feels off. He didn't say anything else, just stared into the darkness beyond the fire, as if waiting for something to step out from the shadows. The hours passed slowly. We took turns patrolling the perimeter, but each time I ventured out beyond the fire's glow, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The forest, usually full of nocturnal life, rustling leaves, owls, the occasional snap of a twig, was dead silent. Even the wind had died down, leaving the trees standing still, their bare branches looking skeletal against the starry sky. I was halfway through my second sweep of the night when I heard the first howl. It came from deep in the woods, far off but distinct, a long, low howl that sent a chill straight through me. It wasn't like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, and it seemed to carry through the trees, echoing off the mountains. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen, but the forest had gone silent again. I quickly radioed back to Dave. You hear that?" "Yeah." His voice crackled through the radio, low and tense. "Could be wolves, but I've never heard them sound like that before." I didn't respond. Something about the howl had unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I'd heard wolves before, plenty of times. This was different, more primal, more, deliberate. I finished my sweep and headed back toward camp, where Dave was standing by the fire, his hand resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't say anything when I approached, just nodded in the direction of the woods. Another howl echoed through the night, this one closer, much closer. "We should check it out," I said, though every instinct in me was screaming to do the opposite. But we were rangers. It was our job to make sure the park was safe, even if that meant walking toward the thing making those god-awful sounds. Dave nodded and grabbed his flashlight. We moved together, stepping beyond the light of the fire and into the darkness of the woods. The beam of my flashlight cut through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows. The crunch of leaves beneath our boots was the only sound, and with each step, my nerves tightened. The howls had stopped, but the woods were far from quiet. There was a tension in the air, a sense of something unseen moving just out of reach. I kept my hand close to the bear spray on my belt, though I had a sinking feeling that whatever was out here, bear spray wasn't going to help. We walked for what felt like an eternity, deeper into the forest, following the direction of the last howl. The trees were dense here, their trunks thick and twisted, and the underbrush was hard to navigate. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned the light, there was nothing there, just shadows. Then, without warning, the smell hit us. It was rancid, like something rotting, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of blood. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve. Dave swore under his breath, his flashlight sweeping the area in front of us. "Jesus," he muttered. "What the hell is that?" We followed the stench to a small clearing, and what we found there made my stomach drop. A deer, or at least what was left of one, lay in the center of the clearing. Its body was torn apart, entrails spilling out into the snow. But what struck me most was how clean the kill was. The limbs had been ripped off, not chewed through, and the head was nowhere to be seen. "That's not a wolf," Dave said quietly, kneeling down beside the carcass. "No way!" I didn't respond. I couldn't take my eyes off the tracks. They were huge, far too big to belong to any wolf or bear. They were more like footprints, but twisted, elongated, with deep claw marks at the toes. Whatever had done this wasn't just an animal. It was something else. The wind shifted then, and from somewhere in the trees came a low, rumbling growl. Dave stood up slowly, his hand moving to the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Yeah," he said, his eyes scanning the darkness. We stood there, frozen, listening. The growl came again, this time from behind us, then another from the left, and another from the right. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization sank in. We were surrounded. The trees shifted, and for a split second I saw it, a massive, hulking figure moving between the trees. It was too fast to make out clearly, but it was tall, at least 7 feet, with long, muscular limbs and glowing yellow eyes that cut through the darkness like fire. Dave raised the rifle, his breath coming in short, quick bursts. Whatever it is, it's hunting us." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. "We need to get back to camp." He nodded, and without another word, we turned and started moving, fast but careful, trying not to make too much noise. The growling followed us, the sounds of footsteps, heavy, deliberate crunching through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my ears, my grip tightening on the bear spray as though it would somehow protect me. We were almost back to camp when the howling started again, this time louder than ever. It echoed through the trees, rising and falling in waves, each note more desperate, more predatory than the last. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it, clearly this time. The creature stepped out from the shadows, just for a moment, illuminated by the faint moonlight breaking through the trees. It was massive, easily taller than any man, its body covered in thick, matted fur. It walked on 2 legs, but hunched over like some kind of grotesque wolf-human hybrid. Its eyes glowed with a sickening yellow light, and its mouth was open, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. We didn't wait. We ran. The footsteps thundered behind us, the creature crashing through the trees as it chased us down. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not with that thing behind us. We burst into the clearing where our camp was set up, and I dove for the truck. Dave was right behind me, slamming the door just as the creature reached the edge of the firelight. It stopped, its glowing eyes watching us, but it didn't come any closer. It just stood there, breathing heavily, its massive chest rising and falling, as though it was waiting. Dave floored the gas, and we sped out of there, leaving the creature behind. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Its image was burned into my mind. We never found out exactly what it was that hunted us that night, but I know one thing for sure. It wasn't just an animal, and it wasn't done with us. Story 18. The walls were covered in frantic scrawlings, a desperate litany against some unspeakable horror. As I read the words, "Wendigo curse," over and over, the scratching at the cabin door grew louder. I knew then that I wasn't alone in these woods, and whatever was out there was far from human. My name is Daniel, and I was, an avid solo hiker. I'd been trekking through the backwoods of northern Minnesota for years, always pushing myself to explore more remote, untouched areas. It was on one of these expeditions that I stumbled upon the cabin and the nightmare that awaited me there. It was late October, and I'd set out for a week-long hike through a particularly isolated stretch of forest. The fall colors were in full glory, painting the landscape in vibrant reds and golds. The air had that perfect crisp bite to it that makes you feel alive. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have this wilderness all to myself. 3 days into my trip, the weather took a turn. Dark clouds rolled in, bringing with them a bone-chilling wind and the promise of snow. I knew I needed to find shelter fast. That's when I spotted it through the trees. An old cabin, its weathered wood blending almost seamlessly with the surrounding forest. As I approached, a sense of unease settled over me. The cabin looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. But beggars can't be choosers in a storm, so I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, years of neglect evident in the thick layer of dust covering everything, but it was dry, and that was all that mattered as I heard the first patters of sleet hitting the roof. I shrugged off my backpack and started to set up camp, grateful for the shelter. It wasn't until I'd gotten my lantern lit that I noticed the walls. At first glance, I thought it was just peeling wallpaper, but as I held the light closer, my blood ran cold. Every inch of wall space was covered in writing, frantic, desperate scribbles that spoke of a terror beyond imagining. The Wendigo hungers. It never stops. The curse spreads. Don't let it in. Over and over, these phrases and others like them were scrawled across the walls, ceiling, even the floor. Some were written in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The handwriting grew more erratic as it progressed, as if the writer was losing their grip on sanity with each word. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Wendigo. I knew the legend, of course. A creature from Algonquian folklore, a man-eating monster born from human cannibalism. But that's all it was supposed to be, a legend. As if in response to my thoughts, a howling wind kicked up outside, rattling the cabin's old bones. I jumped at the sound, my nerves already frayed by what I'd discovered. That's when I saw the journal. It was lying open on a rickety table in the corner, its pages yellowed with age. With shaking hands, I picked it up and began to read. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas Erickson, a forest ranger who'd been stationed in this area decades ago. His early entries were mundane enough: reports on wildlife activity, weather patterns, the occasional lost hiker. But as I flipped through the pages, a chilling narrative began to unfold. Thomas wrote of strange occurrences in the forest. Animals found mutilated in ways that defied natural predators, hikers going missing at an alarming rate, and always, the feeling of being watched by something ancient and hungry. The final entries were almost incoherent, filled with rambling descriptions of a creature that Thomas claimed was stalking him, tall and gaunt, with antlers like a deer and eyes that glowed with an unholy light. The Wendigo. I was so engrossed in the journal that I almost missed the sound at first. A soft scratching coming from the cabin door. I froze, straining my ears. It came again, louder this time. Something was out there, trying to get in. My heart pounding. I crept to one of the boarded-up windows and peered through a crack. What I saw out there will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its emaciated body a mockery of the human form. Papery skin, stretched tight over protruding bones, and atop its skull sat a rack of antlers that put any deer to shame. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me, glowing orbs that seemed to pierce right through the cabin walls to where I hid. The Wendigo, for what else could it be, tilted its head, scenting the air. Then it smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It knew I was inside, and it was hungry. I scrambled away from the window, my mind racing. The scratching at the door grew more insistent, accompanied now by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. I had to get out of there, but how? The Wendigo was blocking the only exit. In desperation, I turned back to Thomas's journal, flipping frantically through the pages. There had to be something, some clue on how to survive this nightmare. And there, on the very last page, I found it. The Wendigo feeds on fear as much as flesh, Thomas had scrawled. Stay calm. Don't let it in, not just to the cabin, but to your mind. That's how the curse spreads. As if to challenge this advice, the creature outside let out a bone-chilling shriek. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a mixture of human agony and bestial hunger that set every nerve in my body on fire. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but then I remembered Thomas's words, "Don't let it in." With a supreme effort of will, I forced myself to lower my hands and breathe deeply. The Wendigo howled again, but this time I didn't flinch. I focused on calming my racing heart, on pushing back the tide of panic, threatening to overwhelm me. Hours passed like this, in a surreal standoff between man and monster. The Wendigo circled the cabin, sometimes scratching at the walls, sometimes calling out in that terrible voice. But I held firm, repeating Thomas's words like a mantra. Don't let it in. Don't let it in. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, the sounds outside finally ceased. Cautiously, hardly daring to hope, I approached the door and peered out. The forest was silent and still, no sign of the horrors that had transpired during the night, but there, pressed into a patch of mud by the cabin steps, was a single footprint, It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, with the clear impression of wickedly curved claws at the end of each toe. I didn't wait around to see if the creature would return. I grabbed my gear and ran, not stopping until I reached my car miles away. As I sped back towards civilization, my mind reeled with what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as a bad dream or a hallucination brought on by isolation and fear, but I knew the truth. The Wendigo was real, and it was still out there. I've never gone back to those woods. I can't bear the thought of what might be lurking in the shadows between the trees. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself thinking about that cabin, about Thomas Erickson and his desperate warnings scrawled on the walls, and I wonder, did I really escape the Wendigo's curse? Or did I just bring it back with me, a seed of ancient hunger waiting to sprout in the fertile soil of modern desperation? Because that's the thing about old legends. They don't die, they just wait, patient as the mountains, for someone to stumble upon them and give them new life. And in a world growing ever more disconnected from nature, ever more consumed by its own appetites, the Wendigo might find plenty to feast upon. So if you're ever in the deep woods and you feel eyes upon you that don't belong to any natural creature, remember Thomas's words. Don't let it in, not to your shelter and not to your mind. Because once the Wendigo has a taste of you, it never stops hunting, never stops hungering, and it's always, always watching. Story 19. The first roar echoed off the valley walls, so deep and guttural that I could feel it in my chest before my ears registered the sound. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear, stars scattered across the blackness above. No, this sound was something else, something alive. And by the time I realized what it was already too late to turn back. We'd planned this kayaking trip for months, me and my friend Mike. 2 days of navigating the remote river valley, camping on the banks, and soaking in the quiet isolation. It was the kind of place that didn't see a lot of traffic. The few people who ventured out here were hardcore adventurers or stubborn locals who knew the land better than anyone. Mike and I considered ourselves somewhere in between, experienced but always looking for something new, something that pushed us just a little further. The river had been calm all day, carving a path through towering cliffs and dense, old-growth forest that made the outside world feel a million miles away. We'd paddled for hours, barely speaking, letting the current do most of the work. It was peaceful, the kind of peaceful that makes you feel like you're the only person alive, surrounded by nothing but the steady rhythm of your breathing and the sound of the water lapping against the kayak. As the sun began to dip behind the ridge, casting long shadows over the valley, we decided to find a spot to set up camp. There was a small sandy bank just around the bend that we'd scoped out earlier in the day, secluded, flat and close enough to the river for easy access. Perfect. We dragged our kayaks ashore and started setting up camp. The evening was cool, the kind of refreshing chill that came after a long day of paddling under the sun. Mike worked on getting the fire going while I set up the tents. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, a scent that always made me feel grounded, like the world had slowed down just for us. By the time the fire was crackling, the sky had turned a deep shade of purple, and the first stars were beginning to peek out from behind the clouds. Mike handed me a beer, and we sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. It was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the fire or the soft murmur of the river as it moved lazily beside us. It was the kind of night that makes you forget about everything else. But then, out of nowhere, came that sound, the roar. It started low, so low that at first I thought it was just the wind picking up through the valley. But then it grew, rising in pitch and intensity until it became something primal, something that didn't belong in the peaceful silence of the wilderness. It vibrated through the air, shaking the ground beneath us, a sound so deep it felt like it was coming from the earth itself. Mike and I exchanged a look, the same thought running through both our heads. What the hell was that? "Did you hear that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mike stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line at the edge of our camp. Yeah, I heard it. We stood there for a few moments, listening, but the roar had faded, leaving behind a silence that felt more oppressive than the sound itself. The fire crackled, its warmth suddenly feeling a lot less comforting. It's probably just a bear, Mike said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. A bear doesn't sound like that, I muttered, my eyes scanning the trees. I'd heard bears before. This was something else, something bigger. We listened for a while longer, but the night had returned to its eerie quiet. The wind had died down, and even the usual nighttime sounds, the chirp of insects, the rustle of leaves, seemed muted, as if the whole valley was holding its breath. Mike tried to shake it off, grabbing another beer from the cooler. I'm sure it's nothing. Probably just the echo off the cliffs making it sound worse than it is. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The shadows around the campfire felt too deep, too close. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting something to step out of the darkness. We ate dinner in silence, neither of us mentioning the roar again, though I could tell Mike was just as on edge as I was. Every now and then, I'd catch him looking over his shoulder, his eyes darting toward the woods. By the time we crawled into our tents, the fire had died down to glowing embers, and the sky above was a blanket of stars. The valley was still, the river flowing gently beside us, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the soft sound of the water, my mind replaying that roar over and over again. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke with a start to the sound of something moving outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just a soft, shuffling noise, like something brushing through the trees. I held my breath, listening. It could have been the wind, but then I heard it again, closer this time. Something was moving around the camp. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly unzipped the tent, careful not to make too much noise. The cool night air rushed in, and I peered out, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The campfire had long since gone out, leaving only faint wisps of smoke curling into the night. At first, I didn't see anything. The camp looked the same as it had when we'd gone to bed, tents, kayaks, and the faint outline of the river beyond. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, something massive, standing at the edge of the tree line. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was huge, at least 9 feet tall, its broad shoulders and long arms silhouetted against the faint light of the stars. It was covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to blend into the shadows of the trees. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, my tired mind playing tricks on me, but then it moved. The creature stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and I saw the glint of its eyes, 2 yellow glowing orbs that locked onto me. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Its face was somewhere between human and ape, with thick, muscular features and a jaw that jutted out, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. The creature didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating, like it was draining the air from the night itself. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, my breath coming in shallow gasps. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other, me from the opening of my tent, and it from the edge of the trees. It didn't move, didn't growl or snarl. It just stood there, watching me, as if deciding whether or not I was worth its time. Finally, it turned and disappeared back into the trees, its massive form blending into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't move for a long time, my body still trembling with adrenaline. When I finally crawled out of the tent, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale, golden light over the valley. I walked toward the tree line, half expecting to find nothing, to convince myself that it had all been some terrible nightmare. But the tracks were there, huge, deep footprints pressed into the dirt, leading from the trees to our camp and back again. Whatever it was, it had been real. Mike emerged from his tent, bleary-eyed and yawning. "What the hell happened last night?" he asked, rubbing his face. I pointed to the tracks, my voice still shaking. "It wasn't a bear, Mike." His eyes widened as he looked at the footprints, and all the color drained from his face. We didn't stay long after that. We packed up camp in record time, barely speaking, both of us glancing nervously toward the woods every few minutes. As we loaded our kayaks and pushed off into the river, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Whatever was out there in that valley, it had let us go. But it had made its presence known. I've been camping in the wilderness all my life, but I've never felt fear like I did that night. I don't know what we saw. I don't know if I ever want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back to that valley again. Story 20. The eyes staring back at me from the darkness were 8 feet off the ground. In that moment, I knew I wasn't dealing with any ordinary animal. Whatever was out there in the abandoned campground was something that shouldn't exist in our world. My name is Rachel Martinez, and I've been a park ranger at Shadow Pine National Park for the past 7 years. I thought I'd seen it all. Lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, even the occasional illegal hunting operation. But nothing in my training could have prepared me for what I encountered that moonless October night. It started with a series of strange reports from campers in the popular Whispering Pines campground. They spoke of eerie noises in the night, shadows that moved against the wind, and a pervasive feeling of being watched. Most of my colleagues brushed it off as typical camper jitters, maybe fueled by a few too many beers around the campfire. But something about the consistency of the reports nagged at me. I decided to investigate personally. Armed with my standard gear, flashlight as radio, sidearm, I set out for Whispering Pines just as the sun was dipping below the tree line. The plan was simple. Do a quick sweep of the area, look for any signs of unusual animal activity, and be back at the ranger station before full dark. As I drove down the winding road to the campground, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. The forest seemed different somehow, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. I tried to shake it off as my imagination working overtime, but I couldn't quite manage it. I arrived at the campground entrance to find it deserted. That wasn't too unusual. It was late in the season, and a cold snap had driven most campers back to the comfort of their homes. But as I pulled into the first loop of campsites, I realized something was very wrong. The sites looked like they had been abandoned in a hurry. Tents were still standing, but many were unzipped, their contents spilling out onto the ground. Coolers lay overturned, their contents scattered. At one site, a campfire still smoldered, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Martinez. I'm at Whispering Pines. Something's not right here. The campground's been abandoned, but it looks like people left in a hurry. I'm going to investigate further." Static crackled for a moment before the reply came. "Copy that. Martinez. Be careful out there. Check in every 15 minutes. I acknowledged and clipped the radio back to my belt. Drawing my flashlight, I began a methodical search of the campground. The sense of wrongness grew with each empty site I encountered. Personal belongings were strewn about. Phones, wallets, car keys. Whatever had driven these people away, it had happened so fast they hadn't even grabbed their essentials. As I reached the far end of the campground, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the sidearm at my hip. My flashlight beam darted from tree to tree, seeking the source of the sound. That's when I saw the eyes. They appeared at the edge of my light's reach, twin orbs of yellowish green that glowed with an unnatural intensity, and they were high, far too high to belong to any animal native to these woods. My flashlight beam tracked upwards, revealing a massive, shadowy form that towered over me. For a moment, neither of us moved. I stood there, rooted to the spot by a mixture of terror and disbelief, while the creature regarded me with those impossible eyes. Then it took a step forward, into the full illumination of my flashlight, and I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of bear and man. Thick, Matted fur covered its massive frame, but the proportions were all wrong for any known animal. Its arms were too long, ending in hands, not paws, but actual hands, tipped with wicked claws. But it was the face that truly paralyzed me with fear. The muzzle was elongated like a bear's, filled with teeth that glinted wickedly in the flashlight beam. But there was an intelligence in its eyes that was terrifyingly human. It looked at me not with the simple hunger of a predator, but with a calculating gaze that spoke of higher reasoning. My training kicked in, and I managed to find my voice. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound authoritative despite my terror. "This is a restricted area. You need to leave immediately." The creature's response was a low, rumbling sound that might have been a laugh. When it spoke, dear God, it spoke. Its voice was like gravel being crushed underfoot. "Little Ranger," it growled, "you are the one who doesn't belong here." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't exist in the real world. But as the creature advanced, its massive form blotting out the starry sky above, I knew this was all too real. I turned and ran, abandoning all pretense of bravery. Behind me, I heard the creature give chase, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. I sprinted through the campground, leaping over abandoned gear and ducking under low-hanging branches. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I burst out of the tree line onto the main road, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I ran. My truck was just ahead, its familiar outline a beacon of hope in the darkness. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them. Just as I reached the driver's side door, a massive form slammed into the side of the truck, rocking it on its suspension. I screamed, dropping my flashlight as I scrambled to unlock the door. The creature loomed over me, its hot breath misting in the cold night air. "You can't escape us, little Ranger," it growled. "This forest is ours. It has always been ours." With a surge of desperate strength, I wrenched the door open and threw myself inside, slamming and locking it behind me. The creature roared in frustration, its massive fists pounding on the roof of the truck. The entire vehicle shook with each impact. I jammed the key into the ignition, silently pleading with the engine to start. It sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. I threw the truck into gear and floored the accelerator, tires squealing on the asphalt as I peeled away. In my rearview mirror, I saw the creature standing in the middle of the road, its glowing eyes fixed on my retreating vehicle. As I rounded a bend, I swore I saw more shapes emerging from the forest to join it, darker patches of shadow that moved with purpose. I didn't slow down until I reached the ranger station, my hands shaking so badly I could barely put the truck in park. My colleagues found me there, babbling about monsters and talking bears. They put it down to stress, maybe hallucinations brought on by some kind of toxic fungus in the woods. But I know what I saw, what I heard. The official report blamed the abandoned campground on a sudden bear sighting that spooked the campers. But I know the truth. There's something out there in Shadowpine that doesn't belong in our world. Or maybe we're the ones who don't belong in its world. I still work as a ranger, but I never do night patrols anymore. And on quiet nights, when the moon is hidden and the shadows seem to move of their own accord, I find myself thinking about those glowing eyes and that gravelly voice. Because now I know the truth. The line between our world and the world of monsters is thinner than we think, and sometimes, in places as old and deep as Shadowpine, that line can blur entirely. So if you're ever camping in these woods and you feel eyes upon you in the darkness, eyes that are far too high off the ground, don't dismiss it as just your imagination. Don't assume it's only a bear or a trick of the shadows. Because there are things out there in the dark, things that walk on two legs but aren't men, things that speak with voices that should not exist. And they're always watching, always waiting, for the day when they decide to reclaim what was once theirs.